They told you peace comes from fixing your life, from getting everything right, from controlling every outcome. But if that were true, why do people with the perfect life still feel tired inside? Why do the anxious thoughts keep coming even when things go well? Why does your mind keep spinning when all you want is silence? The truth is, peace was never something you had to chase. It was something you had to uncover. And Buddhism holds the key. For over 2,500 years, monks, sages, and seekers have passed down a path not of escape, but of awakening. A path that doesn't ask you to become someone else, but to finally come home to who you already are. Not through force, not through guilt, but through awareness, through letting go. Tonight, as these teachings unfold, something inside you will shift. The noise will soften, the pressure will ease, and thoughts that once screamed for attention will begin to lose their grip. You'll start to feel space where there used to be stress, calm where there used to be chaos, clarity where there used to be confusion. This isn't just a peaceful voice in the background. This is ancient wisdom reprogramming your mind from within, gently, quietly, permanently. And when morning comes, you won't just wake up. You'll rise, lighter, still, whole. This isn't just another sleep session. This is a reset for your soul. Are you ready? Let's begin. And now the shift begins. From the surface to the stillness, from the noise that's been running your mind for years to the quiet part of you that's been waiting underneath it all. The transformation doesn't need to be loud, it just needs to be real. We begin with the root of it all, the thoughts that grip, loop, spiral, and don't let go. Until now. There's a thought in your mind right now that doesn't belong there. Maybe it's fear, maybe it's shame, maybe it's just an old voice that doesn't know it's overstayed its welcome. And here's what's wild. It didn't knock before it came in. It didn't ask permission. It just walked into your mental space and made itself comfortable. This is how most people live, not because they choose it, but because they never learn another way. They assume thoughts are facts, that if a voice in their head says something painful, it must be true, that if a story repeats itself often enough, it must be reality. But the teachings of Buddhism whisper a quieter truth. Just because a thought arises doesn't mean it deserves your attention. Thoughts don't need to be defeated. They need to be released. And that happens through curiosity. Not the kind of curiosity that wants to analyze or solve, but the kind that simply watches without panic. The thought comes. You don't react. You just observe. And something strange starts to happen. It loses weight. It loses power. It doesn't stick the same way. This is the beginning of letting go without trying to let go. The moment awareness enters, the old habit begins to fade. Not because you forced it, but because you no longer fed it. When the mind reacts, it tightens. When it observes, it opens. One path creates more tension, the other invites peace. And the key to choosing the second path is training yourself to pause before you respond. That pause is not emptiness, it's power. The space between the thought and your reaction is where peace is born. A thought only has life if it's given energy. Energy comes from identification. The moment you say, "This is mine," the moment you say, "This means something about me," You tie your peace to a storm. And storms don't ask for your comfort before they move through. They tear everything with them, unless you become the sky. The sky doesn't mind the weather. It allows every cloud to pass. It doesn't argue with thunder. It doesn't try to hold on to lightning. It just is. And in that being, there's no resistance. And without resistance, thoughts start to dissolve. They stop needing to shout. Because the only reason they shout is because someone inside is still listening like their truth. But thoughts are not truth. They're activity, movement, patterns. A thought is just the brain trying to interpret life using whatever information it has stored. That means most thoughts are made out of old data, things you heard, felt, or feared years ago. If the brain was a radio, most of your thoughts would be static, picked up from other people's stations. To reprogram the mind, you don't argue with static. You tune it out by tuning in. Awareness is the tuning fork that brings you into clarity. When you practice witnessing your thoughts without labeling them, you weaken the grip of conditioning. You start to see patterns you never noticed before, like how most of your anxious thoughts start with "what if," or how most self-critical ones echo a voice from your childhood. And once you notice a pattern, you're no longer inside it, you're above it. That's why mindfulness is not just meditation, it's transformation. It's learning to watch the mind like a landscape, not a battlefield. And when thoughts no longer need to be fought, they don't multiply. They soften, they pass, like clouds losing interest in raining. The goal is not to stop thinking. The goal is to stop letting every thought become a story. Most people suffer because they're caught in narratives that never got questioned. I'm not good enough. I always mess things up. Nothing ever works out for me. These aren't facts, they're loops. And loops only keep spinning when you keep walking in circles around them. The way out isn't through confrontation, it's through stillness. Because stillness is the only state where thought patterns can't hook you. In stillness, you see the bait, and you don't bite. You see the trap, and you walk past it. You feel the pull of an old thought, and you smile, not because it's true, but because it used to control you, and now it doesn't. Thoughts will always arise. That's what minds do. The problem isn't the thought, it's the relationship with it. And relationships can be healed. When a thought shows up and you say, "I see you," it no longer has to fight for attention. That recognition is what it's craving. But when you give it that recognition without identification, it dissolves. It's like a ghost looking for a house that no longer exists. Curiosity is your secret weapon here. Not curiosity that tries to dissect, but the kind that gently leans in. Where did this come from? Is this actually real? What happens if I don't engage? That last question is the real key, because what happens when you don't engage is freedom. You start to notice the body relaxing, the breath softening, the nervous system shifting from high alert to safety. This is what healing feels like. Not dramatic, not flashy. Quiet, subtle, almost unnoticeable at first. But over time, your entire internal climate changes. This is how the thought lets go of itself. Not because you pushed it, but because you stopped needing it. It no longer fits who you're becoming, and the mind always wants to update its files when it realizes the old ones are no longer useful. Think about the thoughts you've outgrown already, beliefs that used to control you but no longer do. At one point, Those thoughts felt permanent. Now they feel silly. That's the nature of thoughts. They pass when you stop holding them hostage. Awareness is like sunlight. It doesn't force the flower to bloom. It simply creates the condition for blooming to happen. When you sit in awareness long enough, the thought that once screamed now whispers. Then it fades, because it realizes it's no longer needed, and you didn't fight it. You didn't win over it. You just stopped believing it was you. And that separation is everything. Buddhist wisdom teaches that the mind is like a guest house. Thoughts come and go. Some stay longer than others. Some are loud. Some are quiet. But none of them own the place. You're the host. You decide how much attention each guest gets. There's a reason monks sit in silence. Not because they're trying to stop thinking, but because they're learning not to chase anything, not even peace, especially not peace. Because peace isn't a thought. It's what remains when thought doesn't take up all the space. When you start noticing thoughts the way you notice sounds in the distance, something profound shifts. The thought comes, and instead of clinging, you breathe. You feel your body. You stay here, not in the past, not in the next 5 minutes, right here, right now. The thought starts to float, like a balloon, and you don't grab the string, you just watch it rise, and something in your body exhales for the first time in years. You're not your thoughts. You're the awareness behind them, the calm behind the storm, the sky behind the clouds. And once you start living from that space, you don't need to force anything to go. You just become the kind of mind that doesn't keep what it doesn't need. And that kind of mind, that's peace. You've just taken the first step in reprogramming your mind. Not by changing your thoughts, but by changing your relationship with them. The weight is lifting, the loop is breaking. You're not trapped in your own mind anymore. You're becoming free without force. One thought at a time. Stay with that stillness. Let it settle deeper. What comes next will build on this calm. We move now into the quiet between desires, where real peace begins. Once the mind stops clinging to thoughts, something quieter begins to surface. Not silence in the sense of nothingness, but silence that feels full, like the space left behind after a storm moves on. And in that stillness, the next habit starts to show itself. Not the racing thought, but the restless wanting, the pull toward more, the itch to escape the now by chasing something else. That's where we go next, not into more desire, but into the space right before it starts. There's a moment most people never notice. It comes before the craving, before the reaching, before the endless scroll, the bite of food, the next distraction. It's so subtle, it gets missed. But that moment is powerful. It's the pause between desires, and inside it is something rare. Peace that doesn't depend on getting anything. The mind has been trained to crave. It has learned, over years of repetition, to reach forward for the next hit of comfort, validation, pleasure, control. But that craving doesn't create peace. It creates cycles. Satisfaction is short-lived, and the next desire comes dressed in urgency. You start to believe you need what you're reaching for, when really, the reach itself is what keeps the tension alive. Buddhism points to the middle, the stillness between wanting and having. That gap most people rush through. It's small at first, a few seconds, but in those seconds, a deeper part of the mind, can wake up. The part that remembers what contentment feels like before the world convinced it to chase something better. The silence between desires isn't about deprivation. It's not about becoming cold or disconnected. It's about returning, coming back to the body, to the breath, to the space that already exists when the next craving hasn't yet taken over. Most people never get to feel this space because they react so quickly. The craving rises and they're already halfway into a behavior. Shopping, scrolling, eating, planning, performing. But when you practice awareness, the craving no longer becomes a command. It becomes a signal. That signal is an invitation to pause, to observe, to sit in the discomfort just long enough to realize it won't break you. In fact, the discomfort is where freedom starts, because it's there that you begin to untangle the mind's need to get something before it allows peace. That formula never worked, and deep down, you already know it. If the next achievement, next compliment, next reward truly gave peace, the mind wouldn't still be restless. And yet, here it is, still reaching. In that pause, you find your power again. You stop chasing and start feeling. You notice how cravings are not just in the mind, but in the body. A tightness, a flutter, a heat. But they pass, if allowed. The trick is not to suppress them, but to witness them. And in that witnessing, they lose their urgency. Most of the pain around desire doesn't come from the craving itself. It comes from believing that you can't be okay without satisfying it. That belief is what Buddhism calls attachment. And it's not just a theory, it plays out in every daily decision. The need to be liked, the hunger for certainty, the itch to win an argument. They all begin with the same illusion, that you need something to be whole. But if you sit in the pause, if you wait a few moments longer than you normally would, something incredible happens. The desire shifts. Sometimes it fades, sometimes it transforms, sometimes it shows you what it was really about, not the thing, but the feeling underneath. Security, love, meaning. These are real needs, but they don't get filled by chasing. They get nourished by presence. You start to see that many of your cravings are echoes of unhealed moments. A child who felt unseen, a moment you felt small, a time when being productive meant being valuable. These moments leave imprints, and the mind tries to fix the feeling by reaching for something that feels good. But no amount of external pleasure heals internal wounds. Only awareness can do that, and awareness lives in the pause. This silence is not empty. It's full of data. It tells you what your body needs, not just what your habits want. It helps you feel the ground again, hear your breath again, remember your enoughness. But it takes courage to stay in it, to not rush to fill the space, to not run to the next goal or grab the next coping mechanism. That space is where your nervous system resets. It's where the cravings start to lose their script. The more you rest in that silence, the more your brain begins to rewire. It starts to associate peace, not with getting something, but with being here. This is the real reprogramming, and it's deep, because the mind will resist at first. It will say you're wasting time, that you're missing out, that peace comes after the next fix. That's conditioning speaking, not truth. Buddhism doesn't say desires are bad. It says attachment to them is what causes suffering, and that suffering can be ended, but only when you learn to be still enough to notice the desire forming. If you can meet it there before it blooms into action, you have a choice, and that choice is where your liberation lives. Let's go even deeper. Desire often masks emotion. We reach for something because we're trying not to feel something else. Boredom, sadness, insecurity, anger. These emotions are uncomfortable, so the mind distracts. But the more you avoid the emotion, the more power it gains. When you sit in the silence between desires, you start to feel what you were avoiding. It may hurt at first, but it's honest. And honesty is the beginning of peace. The craving was never the problem. The avoidance was, and the silence gives you the space to face what was hidden. This is not about suffering on purpose. It's about reclaiming your ability to sit with life as it is, without editing it, without rushing through it, without needing it to be different before you feel okay. Think of the last time you got something you really wanted, a goal, a relationship, a reward. How long did the peace last? A few hours, a few days, and then what? The next craving came. This is the pattern. Satisfaction without awareness leads back to desire, but presence without chasing, that leads to stillness. Stillness is not the absence of desire, it's the freedom to not be controlled by it. That's a different life, a different nervous system, a different mind. You begin to feel grounded instead of pulled, present instead of distracted, calm instead of anxious, and it starts in that one moment. Right after a craving arises, before you act. That's where your power lives. The more you notice this space, the more it expands. What used to be 2 seconds becomes 5, then 10, then minutes where you feel complete without getting anything. That kind of peace can't be bought. It can only be remembered. And you don't need to go to a mountain to feel it. You just need to stay a little longer in the space most people run from. The space between wants, the stillness between decisions, the breath before action. That's where you meet the part of yourself that was never broken, just buried. This practice isn't about being perfect. You will still crave, you will still slip, but every time you return to the pause, you rewrite your patterns. The mind learns, the body softens, the loop weakens. You're no longer a servant to every impulse. You're becoming the observer, the chooser, the presence behind the desire. This is how reprogramming happens. Not all at once, but gradually, through returning, through noticing, through feeling. Each pause is a step away from habit and a step toward healing. The silence between desires is sacred, not because it's rare, but because it's honest. It doesn't try to fix you, it reveals you, and what it reveals is that you are enough. Not later, not when, now. The craving will tell you something is missing. The pause will remind you nothing ever was. That's why it's called peace, and that's why it's worth practicing. The silence between desires teaches the body to stop racing toward the next fix. But even when craving slows, something deeper often stays beneath the surface, something harder to touch. The echo of old pain, the grip of memory, the way yesterday quietly stains today's peace without being noticed. When desire fades, what's often revealed is not emptiness, but history, the kind we didn't ask for, but still carry. This is where the next shift begins, not in running from the past, but in learning not to let it dictate what the present becomes. Some wounds don't shout. They whisper through reactions, a small comment that triggers a big feeling, a harmless face that suddenly reminds you of someone who once hurt you, a peaceful moment that gets interrupted by a wave of shame with no clear cause. This is what it means to live through the past without realizing it. It's not a conscious choice, it's programming. The nervous system remembers things long after the mind says it's time to move on. And so the moment arrives clean, but we bring dirt from yesterday and smudge it before we've even had a chance to really see it. Buddhism doesn't ask us to erase the past. It asks us to stop dragging it across everything we touch. The past happened. It shaped you. But it's not supposed to run your present. That's what mindfulness changes. It doesn't change the past. It changes the way the past sneaks into now and alters your clarity without permission. Mindfulness is not just awareness of breath. It's awareness of when you're seeing the current moment through yesterday's lens. The mind likes to predict based on what it knows. If you've been hurt before, it becomes suspicious. If someone let you down, it becomes guarded. If life disappointed you, it stays alert for disappointment even when none is present. This habit of projecting creates separation between you and peace, between you and people, between you and what's actually happening right now. Because you're not responding to what's in front of you. You're reacting to what it reminds you of. This is how the mirror gets fogged. You're looking at today, but seeing yesterday's reflection. And that blocks truth. It replaces clarity with memory. Not the full memory, but the emotional trace of it. That's what makes it so tricky to notice. It doesn't show up as a conscious thought. It shows up as tension, as withdrawal, as judgment, as defensiveness that feels justified but is rooted in a wound that was never met with full awareness. To meet this kind of pattern, you need presence that doesn't look away. When you feel a reaction rising, ask not what caused it, but where it's coming from. Is this moment actually unsafe, or does it just feel like something that was? Is this person actually the problem, or are they brushing up against a scar I've forgotten I had? That level of self-inquiry takes humility. It takes gentleness. Because the moment you go to war with your past, you invite more chaos. But the moment you observe it without resistance, it begins to soften. The mirror doesn't need to be smashed. It needs to be cleaned, slowly, gently, one layer at a time, not through force, but through understanding. When you learn to feel without explaining, you get closer to the source. The body holds so many moments that never got processed. And until they're felt, they repeat. They reappear as patterns. Same conflict, different people, same fear, different setting. It looks like life is doing it to you again, but really it's your own lens repeating the scene. Mindfulness lets you notice the difference between the moment and the memory. The key is not to deny the past. The key is to stop assuming it belongs in every current interaction. You're allowed to see a new moment as new, even if it reminds you of something painful, even if the emotions are loud. You can acknowledge the feeling without building a story around it. That's where the loop starts to break. One of the most powerful things you can do is say to yourself, "This feels familiar, but it's not the same." That statement alone creates space. It interrupts the assumption that because it feels the same, it will end the same. That pause is where you reclaim choice. You're no longer acting out an old script. You're writing something new. This work is subtle but transformative, because once you start seeing people as they are, not as projections, you free them and you free yourself. You start listening without defending. You start noticing your body's cues before they explode into reaction. You start speaking from what's true now, not from what was true then. That's healing, not just emotionally, but neurologically. You're rewiring pathways that used to jump straight from stimulus to pain. Now, there's awareness in between, and that awareness becomes your freedom. So what does it look like in real time? It looks like a moment when someone criticizes you and your body tenses, but instead of snapping back, you breathe and ask, what part of you feels threatened? It looks like hearing silence in a relationship, and instead of assuming abandonment, you observe the urge to panic and choose curiosity instead. It looks like making space between reaction and response. And in that space, peace starts to grow. Buddhism teaches that the mind is like water. When stirred, it gets murky. But when still, it reflects clearly. The past stirs the water. It brings emotional sediment to the surface. That's natural. But if you sit with the water long enough without adding more movement, it begins to settle, and you begin to see. The practice is patience. The result is presence. Presence that doesn't deny the past, but doesn't get pulled into it either. That's the gift of the mirror that no longer reflects yesterday. It sees now, just now. And in that, the moment becomes sacred again. Let's take this deeper. When the past goes unexamined, it creates identity. You start to say things like, I'm just this way, or this always happens to me. These are not traits. They're imprints. And when you look closely, they dissolve. Not because they were false, but because they were incomplete. They were conclusions made in pain, and pain narrows perception. Healing widens it again. You stop living in defense mode. You stop looking for red flags in everything. You stop treating life like it's going to wound you the way it once did. And here's what's beautiful. You become more open, not less protected. Because protection was never the answer. Awareness was. The more you practice seeing the moment as it is, the more energy you recover. Because carrying the past into everything is exhausting. It keeps you braced. It keeps you tight. It steals your rest. Mindfulness gives that energy back. Not all at once, but breath by breath, reaction by reaction. Until eventually your nervous system starts to believe that it's safe to be here. Not because life is perfect, but because you're not forcing every moment to look like your worst memory. Even the brain changes. Neuroplasticity means that when you practice responding from awareness instead of reflex, new pathways form. Your brain literally starts expecting peace instead of threat. That's the mirror clearing. That's the old image being replaced with truth. And truth in the present is always quieter than the story. It doesn't shout. It doesn't justify. It just is. You'll know you're touching it when a moment arises, and you respond not with a conditioned fear, but with calm. Not because you planned it, but because you've trained your mind to stay here. You're not broken for having triggers. you're human. But you don't have to be run by them. You can meet them, you can listen to them, and then you can choose something else. That's power. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind, the kind that builds over time, the kind that stays when everything else changes. So next time a moment arises and it feels heavy or sharp or strangely familiar, pause. Ask, is this about now or is this about then? That question alone can break a pattern that's been looping for decades. And in that break, there's light. The kind of light that doesn't just shine on you, it shines through you. Because you've stopped dimming the present with a past that no longer belongs here. This is how the mind returns to peace, not by erasing its scars, but by no longer confusing them for truth. You are not your story. You are the awareness that sees the story, and that awareness has the power to choose what stays and what's released. So let the mirror reflect this moment, just this moment, and let that be enough. When the mirror of the mind is finally clear, something unexpected is often revealed. Not more peace at first, but an old voice, a familiar one, quiet but constant. It speaks in tone, in tension, in thoughts that say, not enough, never enough. It doesn't yell, but it's always there. That voice is not the past. It's what the past left behind, the inner critic, the one who judges before you even speak, the one who turns peace into pressure. This is where we go now, not to fight that voice, but to meet it differently, gently, fully, because the whisper that calms the judge is not louder, it's kinder. Every person carries an internal dialogue. Some of it is useful. It helps make decisions, check priorities, recall what matters. But for many, that voice turns on itself. It starts to attack instead of support. It compares, it doubts, it scolds. It turns every mistake into proof of failure, every vulnerability into a flaw. Over time, that voice becomes so normal that most people don't even notice it anymore. It just blends into the background like an old habit. But that habit is heavy. It drains joy. It erodes self-trust. It keeps the nervous system in a state of tension, even when nothing's wrong. Buddhist practice teaches that suffering is not just what happens to us, it's how we relate to what happens. The inner critic is a relationship, and it's one that's been conditioned through years of unmet needs, early punishments, high expectations, cultural messages, and emotional confusion. That voice didn't start with cruelty, it started with fear. Fear of rejection, fear of unworthiness, fear that love is something to earn, and so it became a strategy. If I judge myself first, I'll be safe from being judged by others. But the strategy becomes the prison. The very voice that was supposed to protect ends up becoming the source of suffering. So what do? Not silence it, not scream back at it, not cover it with fake positivity. Buddhism offers something better, compassion, not as a concept, but as a direct experience. Compassion isn't passive, it's powerful. It sees clearly and responds gently. It recognizes pain and doesn't turn away. When applied to the inner critic, compassion becomes a new language, one the nervous system hasn't heard in years. Start by noticing the voice, not just what it says, but how it says it. Is it harsh? Is it fast? Is it repeating old lines that sound like someone else's voice? Awareness is the first medicine. When you observe the inner critic without joining it, you create space. That space is where healing begins, because in that space, you realize the voice is not the truth. It's a pattern, a habit of thinking that can be rewired. Next, explore what that voice is trying to protect. Often, underneath judgment is fear. The critic says, "You're lazy," when it really means, "I'm scared you'll fail." It says, "You're not lovable," when it fears rejection. When you stop believing the words and start listening to the emotion underneath, the voice begins to soften. It no longer feels like an enemy. It feels like a wounded part of you asking for help in the only language it knows. That's where compassion steps in. Instead of arguing with the critic or pushing it away, you meet it like you would meet a scared child. With patience, with kindness, you begin to respond with gentle truth. Not flattery, not ego, just kindness that's grounded in reality. When the voice says, "You messed everything up," you respond with, "I did my best with what I knew then." When it says, "No one will understand you," you say, "I'm allowed to be seen, even if not everyone agrees." These statements rewire the internal narrative. Slowly, consistently, they teach the brain a new way to interpret failure, vulnerability, and growth. One of the most powerful teachings in Buddhism is metta, loving kindness. It's not about making everything pretty, it's about meeting suffering with softness. When you practice metta for yourself, you're not being selfish, you're healing the root, because a harsh mind cannot create a peaceful life. The way you speak to yourself shapes every interaction. It colors how you treat others. It affects your choices, your boundaries, your creativity, your courage. A mind soaked in judgment becomes tense, reactive, closed. A mind bathed in compassion becomes resilient, open, calm. That shift doesn't happen overnight, but it begins the moment you stop agreeing with cruelty, even when it's coming from your own thoughts. Especially then. You may ask, how do I know if it's my intuition or just the critic? That's a good question. Intuition feels clear and calm, even when it's firm. The critic feels tight and sharp. Intuition guides. The critic punishes. When you learn the difference, you begin to trust yourself again. You begin to follow inner wisdom instead of fear. That's a major shift. Because once you trust yourself, the critic loses its power. Its warnings stop sounding like truth and start sounding like echoes from an old system that no longer fits your life. Some people think self-compassion makes you weak, that it lowers standards or makes excuses. But the opposite is true. Self-compassion creates a safe internal space where growth can happen. You're more likely to take risks, try new things, and recover from setbacks when you're not afraid of your own thoughts. Discipline with kindness is more sustainable than discipline through shame. The science agrees. Studies show that people who practice self-compassion are more motivated, more emotionally balanced, and less likely to fall into cycles of depression and anxiety. So, how do you start? Begin with noticing. Throughout your day, catch moments where the inner critic speaks. Don't fight it, just name it. That's the judge. Then breathe. Then ask what you actually need in that moment. Maybe it's rest, maybe it's support, maybe it's permission to not be perfect. Then respond with a whisper. a phrase that calms instead of cuts. I hear you. I'm safe. I'm growing. This may feel strange at first. That's okay. You're not just changing words, you're changing a whole nervous system, a whole history of responses. But every gentle thought is a step toward peace. Every kind word is a brick in the foundation of a softer, stronger mind. And as the inner critic softens, something else rises. Gentle thinking. Not passive, not vague, but clear thinking that doesn't need to be harsh to be honest. Thoughts that correct without cutting. Thoughts that guide without gripping. This is the mind returning to its natural rhythm, one not distorted by shame, but shaped by understanding. You begin to notice when you're being unfair to yourself. You pause before spiraling. You catch the judgment before it lands. You replace it not with denial, but with truth delivered in a way that your heart can hold. That's transformation. Not loud, not instant, but real. You're building a mind that can hold itself, that can witness struggle without making it mean failure, that can meet insecurity without collapsing, that can walk through the world with quiet confidence, rooted not in perfection, but in self-respect. And when that mind meets others, something beautiful happens. You become safer for the people around you. You stop judging as much. You start listening more. You stop assuming the worst in others because you've stopped assuming the worst in yourself. The inner critic doesn't just affect you, it affects your whole world. So when you soften that voice, the world around you softens too. This is not the same as losing standards. This is rising from a place of wisdom instead of war. The whisper that calms the judge is not weak. It's the voice of healing. It knows what you've carried. It knows what you've tried. And it's here to say, that's enough. You are enough. From this space, decisions are clearer. Relationships are healthier. Challenges are less overwhelming. You don't just survive your mind, you lead it. You become the steady center, the one who walks through storms without adding wind. You may still hear the critic sometimes, but it won't be in charge anymore. It won't define your worth. It won't be the final word. Because now there's a stronger voice within, a quieter one, a wiser one, the one that says, even now, you're still whole. Stay with that voice. Let it speak. As the inner critic begins to soften, as gentle thinking starts to take its rightful place, something else becomes visible, something even quieter. It's not a thought, not yet. It's the space just before one forms, the calm right before the noise, the soft presence that lives between awareness and reaction. And in this space, there's a rare kind of freedom, one most people never experience because they're always a few seconds too late. That's where we go now, not into what the mind thinks, but into what it does before thinking begins. There's a subtle moment just before thought enters, a microsecond of stillness. Most miss it. They wake up already reacting. They speak already defending. They act already driven by patterns they don't remember choosing. But when the mind learns to pause before it moves, something ancient starts to return, a kind of wisdom that doesn't need to prove itself, a calm that doesn't need permission. This is the thought that bows before arising, and when it does, everything changes. The usual habit is to react, to live in reflex. A sound, a word, a sensation. Anything can trigger a chain of thoughts before awareness even arrives. But Buddhism points to something different. It doesn't just teach how to respond better. It teaches how to see the impulse before it becomes action, to witness the thought before it hijacks the nervous system. That's where power begins, not after the thought is already speaking, but just before. This space is where mental freedom lives. Not the kind that feels like control, the kind that feels like presence. The body knows when it's there. The breath slows, the muscles loosen, the eyes stop scanning. You're not racing to interpret. You're resting in awareness. And in that rest, the mind begins to bow, not in submission, but in respect. It's no longer barging in with assumptions. It's waiting, listening, yielding to the stillness it once tried to escape. To train this awareness takes more than effort. It takes receptivity. You're not trying to stop the mind from thinking. You're allowing it to notice the moment right before thinking takes shape. It's like watching a ripple begin to form on still water and choosing not to throw another stone. That choice is subtle, but it rewires everything. The way thoughts usually form is through momentum. One arises, then another, then another. Before long, a full narrative is running. But when you break that chain at the start, the momentum weakens. The story doesn't build. The body doesn't follow. You remain in clarity. This is not suppression. It's attention. You're not holding thoughts back. You're noticing their beginning and choosing not to let them take over. Meditation teaches this directly, not just as sitting still, but as returning to the exact moment where thought begins and deciding whether to follow it. That decision, repeated over time, creates space. And space is everything. Because in that space, you remember you have a choice, not just about what to think, but whether thinking is even needed. Some thoughts are useful. Most are not. Most are habits. Reactions dressed up as reasoning. Old loops pretending to be insight. But when you pause before thought forms, you see that clearly. You begin to sense the difference between true guidance and conditioned reflex. That awareness doesn't just improve the mind, it purifies it. It removes the clutter that never belonged. The moment before thought also reveals something else, the emotional state behind the thought. Most thoughts don't arise randomly. They rise out of feeling. A tense body breeds anxious thoughts. A hurt heart breeds defensive ones. When you pause before the thought, you can feel the emotion instead of escaping into a story about it. And that's where the real healing begins. You're no longer explaining your pain, you're meeting it. This shift breaks cycles, especially in relationships, before the sarcastic comment, before the defensive reply, before the inner argument starts. If you catch the moment before the thought, you often don't need to say anything at all. You realize the thought wasn't necessary. It was a reaction to a wound, not a response to the moment. And when you don't act from that place, peace follows. Peace doesn't mean never thinking. It means not being dragged by every thought the mind offers. It means the mind starts asking for permission instead of demanding your attention. That permission is trained through repetition. Each time you notice the gap before the thought, you widen it. And in that widening, calm grows. Many people ask, how to live more mindfully. This is the core. Not adding more effort, subtracting more noise, not doing more, thinking less, watching more, listening deeper, trusting that stillness doesn't mean weakness, it means mastery, because the most powerful minds are not the ones that think the most. They're the ones that can stop when silence is enough. To cultivate this pause, start small. Notice the moment right before a decision, before checking your phone, before reaching for food, before replying. Ask yourself, where is this coming from? Then breathe. Let the question hover without rushing to answer it. That pause interrupts the program. It resets the system. It brings awareness online before habit takes over. Over time, your body starts to remember this pause. It starts to settle there. Thought no longer needs to drive every moment. Awareness does, and that awareness becomes the new center, not the mind, but the watcher of the mind. That shift brings dignity to your inner world, because you're no longer a machine running old scripts. You're awake inside your own experience. Some days the space will be small, other days it will stretch wide. That's not the point. The point is consistency. The more often you return to the moment before thought, the easier it is to stay there. You begin to prefer it. Not because you're avoiding life, but because you're finally living it without interference, without constant commentary, without the background noise of shoulds and comparisons and predictions. This is how true mental power returns, not by adding force, but by removing friction. The thought that bows before arising is not a weak thought. It's a wise one. It's not silent out of fear. It's silent out of clarity, because it knows when to speak and when to stay still. That kind of mind is rare, but it's trainable. And it starts with noticing what most never notice, the beginning. Thoughts have always seemed like the start, but they're not. Awareness is. And when awareness leads, thought follows with humility. It serves instead of controls. That's the transformation. That's the freedom. So stay here, in the pause. Let the thought rise and let it bow. Not because you told it to, but because you made room. And room is all it needed. When the mind learns to pause before it thinks, space opens up. In that space, something powerful begins to move. Not a thought, not a word, but the breath. And not just as a physical act of staying alive, but as a quiet teacher that's been there since the beginning. The breath doesn't explain, it doesn't argue, it doesn't remember the past or worry about what comes next. It just moves. And in that movement is the medicine so many have searched for in all the wrong places. This is where the real unlearning begins, not by adding more knowledge, but by letting the breath undo what the mind was never meant to carry alone. Most people breathe to survive. They take air in and out without thinking. But in Buddhist practice, the breath is not just a function, it's a doorway, a guide, a direct path back to the body, and more importantly, back to the parts of the self that have been buried under years of tension, shame, pressure, and fear. Every painful experience leaves a residue. That residue isn't always stored in memory. It's stored in muscle, in posture, in how the breath moves through the ribs or stops short at the chest. The body remembers what the mind forgets, and the breath knows how to reach those places no thought can touch. The first thing suffering does is tighten the breath. A child who feels unsafe holds their breath. An adult who feels judged breathes in short bursts. A person overwhelmed by failure starts to breathe from their throat instead of their belly. Over time, these patterns become normal. The body adapts to pain by shrinking, but peace doesn't live in that kind of breathing. It lives in the breath that returns to fullness, that moves through the whole body like a tide, that enters without fear and leaves without force. That's the breath that unlearns suffering, not just as a concept, but as a physical reality. To understand how breathing changes the mind, you have to feel what happens when it softens the body. When you take a full, slow breath, the nervous system gets a signal that it's safe. And when the nervous system feels safe, the mind stops defending. Thoughts lose urgency. Reactions slow down. The heart rate shifts. Cortisol lowers. This isn't metaphor. It's biology. And it's sacred. When you breathe deeply and with attention, old habits start to loosen. The subconscious, which holds all the scripts you didn't choose, like how to please, how to fear, how to disappear, begins to let go, because it realizes it no longer has to protect. The breath creates an inner signal that says, "We're not in danger anymore." That's the message your body has been waiting to hear. But here's the part most people miss. The breath doesn't work like a machine. You can't use it like a trick. You have to meet it. Let it guide you instead of trying to control it. That means listening to how it moves when you're sad, how it shortens when you lie, how it deepens when you tell the truth. The breath tells you where the pain lives, not to judge it, but to understand it. Sometimes the breath will tremble. That's okay. It's touching something the mind buried. Let it. That trembling is not weakness. It's the body remembering how to feel safely again. The breath doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be present. And through that presence, emotional tension starts to release. Not by force, but by being met with softness. Inherited tension runs deep. Maybe it came from family patterns. Maybe it came from watching others struggle. Maybe it came from a culture that only values speed, success, or silence. Wherever it came from, it ends where the breath begins, because breathing retrains the body to feel without shutting down, to stay open in moments that used to feel like threats, to process without performance. It doesn't erase pain, but it lets pain pass. This practice is subtle. You won't always feel the shift instantly, but over time, something starts to change. You get angry, and instead of snapping, you breathe. You get overwhelmed, and instead of freezing, you exhale. You walk into a moment that once triggered shame, and your shoulders stay relaxed. That's what unlearning looks like. It's not dramatic. It's steady. It's cellular. Every time you choose to breathe with presence, you undo a little more of the conditioning, the belief that love must be earned, that stillness is laziness, that you have to be strong all the time. These beliefs are not just mental, they're embedded in how you breathe, and every breath that breaks those patterns becomes a step toward freedom. There is no final breath that heals everything, but there is a breath that begins, and another that continues, and another that stays, until the space inside you feels like home again. Not because you changed everything, but because you stopped leaving yourself every time discomfort showed up. Buddhism teaches the breath as an anchor, not to hold you down, but to hold you steady. When your thoughts are scattered, the breath says, "Come back." When your emotions spiral, the breath says, "Stay close." When fear rises, the breath says, "We're here now." That rhythm creates trust, not in the world, but in yourself. And when you trust your breath, you don't need to chase peace. You realize it's already here, under the noise. That noise may still try to rise, but now you have something deeper than noise. You have presence. You have a rhythm that can't be taken from you. You have a way to meet yourself that doesn't depend on anything external. In Buddhist meditation, breathing is often the first lesson, but it's also the last, because everything comes back to it. The breath is your original teacher. It was there before the words, before the trauma, before the beliefs, and it will be there long after the thoughts fade. To breathe consciously is to return to the part of you that was never damaged, just buried. Some breaths will feel shallow. Others will feel like they open something ancient. That's part of the process. The breath meets you where you are, not where you're trying to be. And when you let that be enough, the healing begins without needing to be named. Let the breath show you what's ready to leave. Let it show you where you hold, where you rush, where you hide, and let it teach you how to stay. Not in pain, but in presence, because presence is the only place where transformation can happen. You are not unlearning to erase who you were. You are unlearning so that who you truly are can rise without tension, without pretending, without fighting every moment. The breath makes that rise possible, not through effort, through trust. So next time the thoughts feel too loud, next time the body feels too tight, next time the world moves too fast, pause, breathe, and let the breath remind you that your peace is not behind or ahead. It's here, now, moving in and out, asking nothing, giving everything. Stay with that breath. Let it move through every place you forgot to forgive, every place you held too tightly, every place that learned fear instead of love. The breath teaches the body how to soften. It shows the nervous system that not every moment is a battlefield. And once that lesson begins to settle, something surprising happens. Emotions that used to control everything no longer hit as hard. The waves still come, but they don't knock you down the same way. And from that new strength, another lesson begins to unfold, not just how to feel emotions, but how to let them pass without becoming them. Not every feeling is a storm, but the mind often forgets that. So we move now into the next unfolding, the cloud that forgot to storm. Strong emotions are not the problem. They are natural, even necessary. What turns them into suffering is identification. The moment anger becomes my identity, the storm begins. The moment sadness becomes my truth, the thunder rolls. But the cloud does not have to rain. It can pass. And Buddhism shows how, not by resisting emotions, but by allowing them without letting them define who you are. The key is attention without attachment. Most people get pulled into emotions because they believe them. A flash of anger appears and the mind reacts. It builds a story, a defense, a justification. Before long, a full emotional structure has formed and the body is bracing for conflict. But what if the anger had just been seen, not followed? What if it had been met the way you meet a cloud in the sky, noticeable but not personal? This shift is small but powerful. You go from being the storm to watching it. You go from riding the emotion to witnessing it. And in that witnessing, something dissolves. The heat fades faster. The stories lose their grip. The nervous system stays grounded, not because the feeling is gone, but because you didn't build a house for it to live in. Let's look at how emotional escalation usually happens. It starts with a trigger. Something touches an old pain or creates discomfort. That spark ignites a reaction. The reaction becomes a judgment. The judgment becomes a narrative. That narrative fuels more emotion. And now the original feeling has turned into a fire. But none of that had to happen. The initial spark wasn't the issue. It was everything that came after. Buddhism calls this the second arrow. The first arrow is pain. The second is the story we tell about the pain. That second arrow is where the suffering hides. When you learn to stop at the first arrow, the pain can be felt without escalation. Sadness can be held without drowning in it. Anger can rise and fall without turning into destruction. Fear can pass through without shrinking your life. Emotions are like weather. They move, they shift, they clear. But when we identify with them, we trap them. We freeze them in place with thought. We replay them in memory. We rehearse them through reaction. And they stay longer than they need to. Allowing emotion to pass is not the same as avoiding it. It means feeling it fully without trying to change it or make it mean something about you. When frustration rises, you don't need to say, "I'm a bad person." You just say, "This is frustration." You breathe into it. You feel it in your body. You notice its texture. You let it move without adding fuel. That's how a cloud forgets to storm. The breath plays a role here too. It anchors you while the emotion moves. Instead of tightening, you breathe deeper. Instead of speeding up, you slow down. You stop trying to control the emotion and start allowing it to pass through. This is how the nervous system unlearns the habit of panic. It learns that a strong emotion doesn't mean danger. It just means energy moving through. This practice changes your entire experience of life. You stop fearing your own feelings. You stop reacting out of habit. You become emotionally agile instead of emotionally trapped. You can feel deeply without falling apart. You can hold intensity without losing clarity. And here's something most people don't realize. When you stop clinging to emotions, they become teachers. Anger reveals where a boundary was crossed. Sadness shows where something meaningful was lost. Fear reveals where safety is missing. But you can't receive those messages if you're too busy fighting the feeling or getting caught in it. Stillness allows listening, and listening brings wisdom. In relationships, this changes everything. You stop blaming others for how you feel. You take responsibility without shame. You communicate without attack. You notice when you're escalating, and you pause. That pause is not weakness. It's wisdom. It's the moment the cloud decides it doesn't need to storm. Over time, this creates a new emotional pattern. Instead of collapse or explosion, there's observation. Instead of shutting down or lashing out, there's breathing through. And the people around you feel it. They feel your calm. They feel your steadiness. It gives them permission to soften too. Emotional freedom is contagious. But this doesn't mean you suppress. It means you hold, you allow, you feel fully. But you don't get lost. You don't become the anger. You don't become the sadness. You remain the sky, watching the clouds come and go. The storm might visit, but it doesn't live here anymore. You can start practicing this now. The next time a feeling rises, pause. Name it softly. Don't argue with it. Don't explain it. Just breathe with it. Notice where it lives in the body. Is it heat in the chest? A tightness in the throat? A pressure in the stomach? Let it be there, without adding thought, without trying to fix. And when it starts to move, let it. Don't hold it. Don't analyze it. Let it go. Some emotions will rise quickly and fall fast. Others will linger. But all of them want the same thing, to be seen without being locked in. When you allow them to pass, you build a new relationship with yourself. One that's based on trust, not control. On presence, not panic. And when your emotions no longer scare you, life opens. You take more risks. You speak more truth. You connect more deeply. You stop walking on eggshells around your own inner world. That freedom is not the absence of feeling. It's the ability to feel everything without becoming anything you're not. This is the mind returning to balance, the heart returning to safety, the body returning to calm. Not because nothing hard happens, but because you no longer make every wave into a tsunami. Let the cloud pass. Let it move without resistance. Let it forget to storm. And as it does, a deeper clarity emerges. When emotions are no longer treated as storms, the mind begins to relax. It stops bracing for impact. It stops assuming that every wave will turn into chaos. In that calm, something even deeper reveals itself, not just a passing feeling, but a constant hunger. Not for food, not for comfort, but for more. More success, more validation, more improvement. It's quiet, but it's always there. The chase, the voice that whispers, "This isn't enough." Even when everything seems okay, it lingers. The next lesson begins right there, in the moment where the craving has nothing left to cling to, the space where the cup was already full. The craving reflex is subtle. It doesn't always scream. It shows up as a restless scroll through your phone, as the need to prove your worth in a conversation, as the discomfort in just sitting still without checking something. It feels like movement, but it's emptiness disguised as urgency. And Buddhism speaks directly to this, not by removing desire altogether, but by showing how to stop being ruled by it. The mind is trained from early on to believe that happiness is a destination, that peace is a reward, that worth is something to earn. This training is reinforced everywhere, in school systems that measure you, in jobs that rank you, in cultures that reward endless achievement. Over time, you start to believe that who you are isn't enough, that you must be doing, fixing, improving. Even rest becomes something to earn, and stillness starts to feel like laziness. But deep down, that's not truth. That's programming. The cup is full. But the mind was taught to look past it, to assume something is missing. That assumption fuels endless craving. And craving doesn't just want pleasure, it wants distraction. It wants relief. It wants a future where everything is solved, but that future never arrives. It keeps moving farther away, because the craving isn't satisfied by fulfillment. It's satisfied by wanting. It feeds on the idea that peace comes next, later, after. This is the trap that mindfulness breaks, not by shaming desire, but by seeing through it. You don't need to stop having goals or wanting to grow, but when that wanting turns into your identity, suffering follows. You stop feeling the moment. You miss the breath. You lose the beauty that's already in your hands. And your nervous system gets stuck in alert mode, always preparing, always pushing, never settling. Training the mind to rest begins with awareness. You start to notice when the craving arises. You catch it in the small moments, the itch to check, the pull to buy, the impulse to say yes when you mean no. These are not random. They are signals, clues that the mind doesn't feel safe in stillness, that it's been taught to equate enoughness with stagnation. But presence is not stagnation. It's richness. It's the part of life that never arrives tomorrow, because it's always here now. One of the central teachings in Buddhism is that grasping causes suffering, not because desire is wrong, but because the identification with desire creates tension. When you believe you need more to be okay, you'll never be okay. No matter how much you achieve, the mind will find a new problem, a new hunger, a new measurement. That's how craving works. It disguises itself as ambition, but it's rooted in fear, the fear that right now is not enough. So how do you undo this reflex? First, by slowing down, by practicing pausing before reaching, sitting before reacting, listening before deciding. These small shifts interrupt the craving loop. They show the nervous system that it can feel satisfaction without stimulation, that it can rest without being punished. This takes time, it takes repetition, but each moment you choose stillness over chasing, the loop weakens. Meditation helps, not because it makes you stop thinking, but because it shows you the thoughts you usually obey. You begin to hear the craving before it becomes action. Check your phone. Fix this now. Make it better. But in meditation, you don't follow. You breathe, you sit, and the craving starts to lose its script. That's not failure. That's rewiring. But this isn't only about stillness. It's also about gratitude. Not the kind you force, but the kind you notice, the warmth of a quiet moment, the sound of your breath, the small victories that didn't need to be posted. Gratitude returns the mind to reality, to the part of life that doesn't need improvement, to the cup that was already full. Gratitude, when practiced consistently, reshapes perception. It trains the mind to see what's here instead of what's missing. This isn't toxic positivity. It's presence. It's saying, yes, there are things I want to grow into, but today, this is enough. This moment, this body, this breath. And in that enoughness, the nervous system exhales. The fight to prove something drops, and peace begins to feel natural instead of earned. There's also a physical layer to this. The body mirrors the mind. If the mind is always chasing, the body stays tense, shoulders tight, jaw clenched, hands fidgeting. But when the mind starts to recognize enough, the body loosens. You stop moving to escape. You start moving with presence. Walking becomes meditation. Eating becomes sacred. Talking becomes listening. Everything slows down without becoming dull, because awareness adds color to the ordinary. This isn't about rejecting ambition, it's about grounding it in wholeness. When you grow from peace, your progress is clean. It doesn't leave burnout behind. But when you chase from fear, every win feels temporary. Every goal becomes a new standard to survive. You live in a prison of expectations you never consented to. So return to the cup. Ask yourself, what if nothing needed to be added right now? What if the feeling of lack was a thought, not a truth? What if fullness wasn't about things or status, but about being awake to the life already unfolding? You'll notice how much opens when you stop trying to fill the space, when you let quiet be enough, when you let connection be more important than appearance. When you trust that your worth isn't at the finish line, it's in the fact that you are alive and breathing right now. This is not settling. This is sovereignty. This is choosing presence over pressure. This is not lowering the bar. This is realizing the bar was a trick all along. When the mind stops chasing, the heart starts listening. You begin to hear your own rhythm again. You start to feel what you truly enjoy instead of what you're conditioned to pursue. Simplicity starts to feel like luxury. You return to what matters, not because someone told you, but because craving no longer runs the show. Some days, the reflex to chase will return. That's okay. It's an old habit. But now, you see it. You name it. You breathe through it. You let it pass. And each time you do, the mind remembers the truth. That peace isn't the result of more. It's the result of enough. Let that truth settle. Let it root itself. When the mind stops reaching, the body starts to trust stillness. The craving softens. The breath deepens. And in that soft space, something unexpected rises. Not urgency, not emotion, but a quiet question. Who am I without the chase? When there's nothing left to prove, when the pressure lifts, when no one is watching, what's left? This is where the next layer of freedom begins. A deeper release. Not from desire or emotion, but from identity itself. The story of self that has followed you like a shadow that may not belong to who you truly are. This is the moment the shadow stops following. Every person builds a story of who they think they are. It starts early. Names, roles, traits. You learn to say, I'm the responsible one. I'm the shy one. I'm the helper. I'm the black sheep. I'm the overachiever. These labels get reinforced over time, by praise, by rejection, by memory. They form the identity the mind believes is real, but this identity is not solid. It's a reflection. It's shaped by perception, fear, repetition, and when peace becomes tied to that story, it becomes fragile. Buddhism doesn't deny the self. It invites you to see through it. Not because who you are doesn't matter, but because the mind's version of who you are is usually incomplete. Often it's a defense, a collection of beliefs built to protect against pain. But the protection becomes limitation. You start reacting not to the world, but to the need to keep your identity intact. The strongest suffering happens when identity is threatened, when the image you've built starts to crack, when the role you've clung to doesn't fit anymore. That's when fear rises, not because you're in danger, but because the story is, and the mind doesn't know the difference. This is why people stay in roles that hurt them, why they cling to being right, why they fear change even when they're miserable. Because to let go of the story feels like losing yourself, but in truth, you're not losing anything real. You're letting go of the costume. And underneath that costume is someone more whole than the mind can imagine. The practice begins with noticing the story, the way you describe yourself, the things you say without question. I'm just like this. I can't do that. This is who I am. Pause there. Who gave you that script? Did it come from a moment of truth or a moment of fear? Is it a reflection of freedom or a reaction to trauma? Most identities are born in reaction, to please, to survive, to fit in, and those strategies may have helped once, but now they're habits. And habits can be released, not by attacking them, but by seeing them clearly. Awareness loosens the grip. You begin to realize that you are not your role, you are not your job, you are not your past, you are not the voice that compares, defends, or explains. You are the one who notices all of that. And that noticing is your true identity, not a fixed image, but a fluid awareness. This shift is not easy, because the ego wants control. It wants to know who it is. It wants certainty. But Buddhism teaches that the self is impermanent, ever-changing. And this isn't a problem, it's liberation. Because when identity is no longer fixed, peace becomes flexible. It doesn't break when something changes. It adapts. It flows. Think about how much suffering comes from clinging to being someone. The successful one, the strong one, the victim, the healer, the one who never fails, the one who always needs help. These labels create pressure. They limit growth. They trap potential. But when the labels dissolve, new possibilities open. You start to act from presence instead of personality. You respond to life as it is, not as the version of you the world expects. And that response is more authentic than any role, because it comes from now, not from history. This kind of detachment doesn't make you less human, it makes you more real. You laugh easier, you listen better, you stop defending your image, you start connecting from the core, and people feel it. They relax around you, because they sense you're not performing, you're just being. There will be moments when the shadow tries to return, when old stories whisper in your ear, when the mind says, "Don't forget who you are." But now you pause. You smile. You remember that who you are cannot be reduced to a sentence. You are not a story. You are a silence that watches stories come and go. This awareness changes how you handle conflict. Instead of reacting to protect your image, you respond from clarity. You admit mistakes without shame. You let others be wrong without needing revenge. You stop taking everything personally, because without a rigid identity, there's nothing to protect. And that absence of defense feels like peace. The shadow of identity also hides in comparison, in the need to be seen a certain way. But when you detach from who you think you should be, you stop comparing, you stop competing, you stop shrinking. You simply show up, fully, honestly, with whatever's here. And that honesty brings relief, because the performance ends, the masks fall, the tension releases. You no longer carry the weight of being someone, you just are. Meditation supports this shift. Not because it tells you who you are, but because it shows you what you're not. In silence, the roles fade. The mental chatter loses volume, and what remains is awareness, clear, present, free. From this place, life feels lighter, not because it's easy, but because you're no longer resisting it through the lens of identity. You experience life directly, not through the story of me, but through the openness of now. Letting go of identity doesn't mean you disappear. It means you return to something deeper than the role, to something softer than the armor, to something truer than the story. And in that return, the shadow that once followed you everywhere begins to dissolve. Because now you don't need to be someone, you're already whole. When identity loosens its grip, when the shadow of who you thought you had to be begins to dissolve, the mind doesn't go silent right away. In fact, something else often shows up more loudly: the thinking, not the gentle kind, the racing kind, the constant replaying, rewriting and rehearsing that fills the space once occupied by pressure to be someone. It's the next layer of mental habit, overthinking. And in the quiet, it becomes clear just how deeply the mind has been conditioned to never stop narrating, fixing, preparing. That's where this lesson begins, not in trying to win against the mind, but in learning the art of not finishing the thought. Overthinking is not a flaw. It's a learned response to discomfort. The mind was trained to stay busy as a way to feel safe. If it could predict enough, prepare enough, analyze enough, maybe it wouldn't get hurt. So it kept going. But that safety became noise. And that noise became normal. Now, silence feels strange. Stillness feels wrong. The loop keeps spinning, not because the problem is real, but because the mind doesn't know how to stop without finishing the cycle. The practice is simple, but not easy. To interrupt the loop, gently, to catch the thought as it begins, and instead of following it to the usual conclusion, to stop, to return, to choose stillness over resolution. This isn't avoidance, it's clarity. Most thoughts don't need to be finished. Most questions don't need to be answered right away. Most mental stories lose their urgency when they're not fed. A monk once said, "The thought is not the problem. The second and third thought are. The first thought appears, it's natural, but the second one judges it. The third one reacts to that judgment. And suddenly, the mind is miles away from the moment." The lesson here is not to destroy thought. It's to see it without entering it, to notice the beginning and gently decline the invitation to follow. This creates a new pattern, not by force, but through interruption. You notice, then you breathe. You catch yourself mid-sentence, mentally, and you stop. You don't need to finish the worry. You don't need to complete the judgment. You don't need to run the full loop of "what if," or "why did I say that," or "how will this turn out?" You let the thought hang. You leave it unfinished. And in doing that, you end the cycle. Over time, the mind starts to change. It learns that it doesn't need to resolve everything to feel safe. It doesn't need to keep spinning to stay prepared. It starts to trust silence, to rest in not knowing. And that's where peace comes in, not from answers, but from freedom from the need to always have one. This practice is called redirection, but it's not forceful. You don't yank the thought away, you guide it, like turning the head of a child gently to look out the window instead of into a screen. You choose to look elsewhere. You shift your attention, maybe to the breath, maybe to a sound, maybe to the sensation of your hands resting in your lap, anything that brings you back to the body, to the present, to the moment that doesn't need fixing. Redirection is not suppression. You're not pushing the thought down. You're letting it go without attachment, like hearing a song in the background and choosing not to sing along, like noticing a cloud without naming its shape. The thought comes, you nod to it, and return. This may feel unnatural at first. The mind will protest. It will tell you the thought is important, that if you don't finish it, something bad will happen, that you'll forget something crucial, that you'll be unprepared. These are just echoes of old habits, not truth. And each time you don't finish the thought, that habit weakens. You're training your mind to live in reality instead of rehearsal. Reality is what's happening now, not the imagined scenario 10 minutes or 10 years from now. When you live in the now, you don't need the loop. You meet each moment fresh, without dragging a mental script into it. This doesn't mean you'll never think deeply again. It means your thinking becomes intentional, not automatic. You use thought when it's needed. You release it when it's not. That's mastery. That's presence. And presence is where joy begins to return, because you're no longer lost in problems that haven't happened or conversations that never will. This shift also impacts how you relate to others. You stop preparing your responses while someone else is talking. You listen fully. You stop replaying old interactions. You stop over-analyzing your every word. You become lighter, more connected, more real, because you're here, not caught in the delay of thought. Meditation helps build this skill. You sit, a thought comes. You notice it. You let it pass. You return, over and over. This repetition reprograms the reflex. The space between thoughts starts to grow. The pull to finish them starts to fade. You become familiar with the feeling of incompleteness, and instead of fearing it, you start to appreciate it. Incomplete doesn't mean broken. It means open. It means free. When you leave a thought unfinished, you're not missing out. You're making space for calm, for clarity, for stillness that isn't shaped by anxiety. The mind won't always like this. It will try to trick you back into the loop, but now you know the loop isn't a home, it's a habit, and habits can be changed. Start with one loop, one thought, catch it, don't finish it, breathe, return, and feel how much lighter that one small act makes everything. Because in time, the mind learns it doesn't need to run all day to be valuable. It can rest, it can pause, it can listen. And in that pause, something deeper can rise. A quiet intelligence, a still awareness. When thoughts are no longer rushed to their end, when the mind stops sprinting ahead of the moment, something starts to shift in the body. It's quiet at first, subtle, like an exhale held too long, finally released. But beneath that release is something deeper, a pattern that's been running for years, a constant inner rush, a pressure that says life must be fast, decisions must be instant, healing must be immediate, even peace becomes a deadline. But what if that urgency was never yours to carry? What if the stream never needed to hurry? Urgency is a habit, not always on the outside, but inside. Even in moments that appear calm, the mind is often racing, trying to keep up, trying to stay ahead, planning the next step before the current one is even felt. This creates a tension that doesn't always show as panic. It shows as fatigue, as restlessness, as the inability to sit still without needing to move, fix, do. But underneath that movement is fear. The fear that something important will be missed if we don't get there fast. Buddhist wisdom offers a different rhythm. One rooted not in speed, but in timing. Not in rushing to what's next, but in trusting the unfolding. This concept is called right timing. It means letting life open at its natural pace, not delaying what needs to be done, but also not forcing what's not ready. When urgency is replaced with right timing, the nervous system starts to unlearn the belief that it's constantly behind. Internal urgency often comes from early conditioning. Being told to hurry, being rushed through feelings, being rewarded for finishing first, being told that rest is laziness. The body remembers. It holds that tempo, even in silence. But it's not the truth. It's a script. And like any script, it can be rewritten. Rewriting it starts with awareness. Notice the places where you feel behind, even when no one is rushing you. Notice the thoughts that say you should already be somewhere else. Notice how your breath responds, how your shoulders lift, how your jaw tenses. These are signs of internal rushing, not because something urgent is happening, but because urgency has become a reflex. The stream doesn't resist where it is. It doesn't speed up just because the shore is far away. It moves because it moves. With gravity, with time, with patience. And it arrives not through force, but through flow. This isn't passivity, it's presence. It's a refusal to believe the lie that peace must be chased. To begin living this way, start where you are. In conversation, slow down. Let pauses be full. Don't rush to fill the silence. In decision-making, take space. Let clarity arrive instead of grabbing the nearest answer. In healing, trust the season you're in. Some things can't be rushed without damage. Flowers don't bloom faster because we yell at them to grow. This isn't just about behavior, it's about physiology. When you live with urgency, your nervous system stays in fight or flight. Even small decisions feel like emergencies. But when you slow down, when you wait for the right moment instead of the fast one, the body relaxes, the mind clears, and the decision becomes easier, not harder. Right timing also teaches trust, not in fate, but in process, in knowing that everything doesn't need to be done today, that the next step will come when it's ready, that wisdom doesn't always shout. Sometimes it arrives when the mind is quiet and the body is still enough to feel it. Living without hurry doesn't mean nothing happens. It means what happens is more aligned, more sustainable. You stop burning out. You stop second-guessing. You start moving with life instead of against it. That rhythm becomes your medicine. Because what breaks people is not always doing too much. It's doing it all too fast, without time to breathe in between. Let this apply to your inner work too. The mind wants instant growth, immediate healing, but the spirit moves slower. It unfolds over time. Trust that. Give yourself room to not arrive all at once. Some parts of you need more time than others, and that's not failure, that's rhythm. Even in spiritual practice, speed becomes a trap. People want to master mindfulness, achieve peace, dissolve the ego, quickly. But the most profound shifts happen slowly, in layers. When you stop measuring your progress like a race and start honoring it like a pilgrimage. This also affects how you relate to others. When you stop rushing, you listen better. You don't interrupt, you don't assume. You allow people to open at their pace, and they feel that. They feel safe, because you're not pushing them to be faster than their heart can move. Urgency is often tied to control, the idea that if we act quickly, we'll stay safe. That slowness is dangerous, but true safety comes from presence, and presence is only possible when there's enough time to feel, enough space to respond instead of react, enough stillness to see what's really needed. Let your days reflect this. Instead of stacking every moment with tasks, leave space between things. Walk slower, eat slower, speak slower, not to be inefficient, but to be alive. Efficiency isn't speed, it's clarity, and clarity needs room. This doesn't mean life will never be fast again. Some moments require urgency, but they are rare, and when they come from a calm foundation, they're handled better. Because the body knows the difference between real urgency and a habit of hurrying. Let your body relearn a natural pace. Let your breath guide you back to now. Let your mind stop measuring every moment against a deadline that doesn't exist. Peace isn't late. It's just waiting for you to arrive where you already are. You are not behind. You are not slow. You are unfolding, like the stream, without force, without apology. Flowing toward what's meant, at exactly the right time. When the stream slows down and no longer rushes to be somewhere else, something quieter starts to be heard, something that's been there all along. The echoes, not loud, but constant. Thoughts that replay old scenes, not because they're true, but because they're familiar. Feelings that return, not because they belong in the present, but because they were never given permission to leave. These echoes don't come from what's happening now. They come from what happened then, but they shape now anyway. Until you see them, until you meet them, until you stop repeating them without realizing it. That's where the next shift begins, not by erasing memory, but by ending the loop. This is the echo that didn't repeat. The mind is not trying to hurt you when it brings up old stories. It's trying to protect you. If something felt unsafe once, the mind remembers it forever. It creates patterns to avoid being caught off guard again. And those patterns sound like thoughts, but they're really signals. Don't trust this. They'll leave like the others. This looks like before, so it must be the same. That's how a wound becomes a loop. And once that loop starts spinning, it becomes hard to hear anything else. The echo is not the memory. The echo is the unprocessed story attached to it. The voice that says, "This pain defines me. This keeps happening because of who I am." But no pain should have the power to name you. No past should get to dictate your present over and over again, especially when it's no longer here. That's why awareness is everything, because without awareness, the echo plays in the background of every thought, and you start living in reaction to things that aren't even happening anymore. Buddhism teaches that clinging to thought is the source of suffering. But it's not just any thought. It's the thought you return to over and over, hoping that maybe this time it will end differently. That maybe, if you replay it enough, understand it enough, explain it enough, the feeling will go away. But that's not how it works. Thoughts don't heal feelings. Presence does. Repetition keeps pain alive. Attention without attachment lets it fade. To stop reinforcing fear, the first step is to notice when you're telling yourself the same story again. Not just that you're thinking, but what you're thinking. If it sounds familiar, if it feels like a script, if it moves in circles instead of forward, it's probably an echo. Pause there. Breathe. Ask, is this happening now, or is this something I keep pulling into now? Most people assume their thoughts are fresh, but many are just reruns. Reruns of a moment you didn't understand at the time. A heartbreak, a betrayal, a silence that felt like rejection. You didn't have the tools back then to process it, so the mind held onto it like a page bookmarked in panic. And now it keeps flipping back to it, hoping to resolve something that can't be resolved through thinking alone. The goal is not to silence memory, it's to stop living in response to it, to stop letting it color your view of people, moments, yourself. Because every time the old story is repeated, it deepens the groove, like water carving into rock. Eventually, it becomes the only path the mind knows how to take. But paths can change. Thought patterns can change, and they don't change through force. They change through interruption and redirection. That means choosing not to follow every thought that arrives, especially the ones that start with "what if," "always," "never," or "I knew it." These are not insights, they're reflexes. They sound wise, but they're fueled by fear. You don't need to fight them, you need to see them, gently, consistently, and then choose something else. Choosing something else might be as simple as returning to your breath, as feeling your feet on the ground, as asking, what's real in this moment? The truth is usually quieter than the echo. It doesn't demand, it doesn't panic, it just is. And that's why most people miss it, because they're still chasing the loud thought that promises safety, but only delivers tension. Breaking the echo also means forgiving yourself for needing it, for believing it, for building habits around it. You weren't weak. You were trying to stay safe, and now that safety has become a cycle, one you can step out of, not by pretending the past didn't happen, but by choosing not to relive it mentally every time a situation feels similar. This is deep nervous system work, because repetition creates a kind of muscle memory. The body starts to react before the mind even finishes the thought. A person looks at you the wrong way, and the stomach tightens. An email goes unanswered, and the heart races. But none of it is new. It's old tension, looking for confirmation that it should still be afraid. Presence interrupts that. It says, we're not there anymore. It says, this is new. It says, let's meet this moment as it is, not as the past feared it might be. Sometimes the echo comes in the form of inner dialogue. I always mess things up. They'll leave like the others. I can't trust anyone. These thoughts aren't facts. They're fossils, leftover pieces of a moment that hurt too much to process at the time. But you're stronger now, and your mind doesn't have to be stuck in the same pattern forever. You can speak differently to yourself. You can say, "This might not be what it looks like. I don't need to predict pain to be safe. It's okay not to know how this ends. And most of all, I am not who I was when this pain began." These new thoughts don't erase the echo immediately, but they change its volume. They shift the tone. Over time, the nervous system recalibrates. The mind begins to trust that silence doesn't mean danger, that stillness doesn't mean punishment, that this breath doesn't have to carry the weight of years before it. Letting go of the echo doesn't mean forgetting. It means freeing the present from being shaped by pain that already happened. It means recognizing that the thought is familiar, but it's not current. That you can feel fear without feeding it. That you can meet discomfort without narrating it with the worst possible story. This is the beginning of peace that doesn't rely on the past agreeing with you. It relies on the present being allowed to speak louder than memory. When you stop repeating the echo, you give space for something else to be heard. And what you hear in that space is not more pain. It's your voice, returned, clear, unafraid, finally allowed to speak without whispering through old wounds. From here, the silence becomes healing, not because it erases what happened, but because it no longer drags it forward. Let the echo end here. When the echo finally fades, when the loop is no longer fed, what follows isn't just peace, it's space. A kind of internal openness that most people aren't used to. No noise, no script, no prediction, just quiet. And for many, that quiet feels strange, even frightening, because they've spent so long inside mental sound that silence feels like absence. But what if that absence isn't emptiness at all? What if it's the presence of something deeper, waiting to be felt? This is where the next part of the journey begins, where silence stops being the enemy, where it becomes the medicine. This is the silence that untrained the noise. Noise is not just what's loud, it's what's constant. The background hum of worry, the low drumbeat of judgment, the ticking of plans, comparisons, explanations. Most people don't even realize how much noise they carry because it becomes normal. The mind is always working, thinking about what to say, what to fix, what to regret, what to protect. This noise builds slowly, but over time, it becomes a filter. Every moment is seen through it. Every breath is felt through it. And because it never stops, the nervous system never fully relaxes. Buddhist practice speaks often about stillness, not as inactivity, but as clarity. Stillness isn't the absence of movement. It's the absence of unnecessary reaction. It's the space where the mind stops chasing itself, where thought arises but doesn't escalate, where silence doesn't mean void, it means presence without pressure. But to get there, the body must first unlearn the fear of silence. Because for many, silence has become associated with danger, with boredom, with loneliness, with vulnerability. They reach for the next thought, because the quiet feels like it's pulling something uncomfortable to the surface. And in a way, it is, because silence doesn't hide your patterns, it reveals them. That's why most people drown it out. Yet it's in that revealing that real healing begins, because what's revealed can be felt, and what's felt without resistance begins to move. Silence shows you what you've been carrying, and once you see it clearly, It no longer controls you from the shadows. Detoxing from noise doesn't happen all at once. It begins with moments, with noticing the compulsion to fill every second, to check something, to answer someone, to fix your mood. It's noticing the itch to escape a pause and choosing not to scratch it. That choice is powerful, because each time you don't react to the craving for noise, the craving weakens. This is not about silence on the outside, it's about quieting the pressure inside. You could be alone in a room and still be noisy, or you could be walking through a busy street and still be in stillness. It's not about what surrounds you, it's about how you meet what surrounds you, with presence or with resistance. Meditation trains this presence, not by forcing stillness, but by returning to it, over and over. The mind leaves, the body reacts, the thought storms rise, and you return. That return is the path. It teaches the system that silence is safe, that it doesn't mean disconnection, it means reconnection to yourself, to the body, to the breath, to the ground beneath your feet. Eventually, silence stops being scary. It becomes sacred. A place where nothing needs to be said because everything is already understood. Where the mind gets to rest without needing to be explained. Where awareness sits quietly and watches life without rushing in to edit it. When you stop reinforcing the mental noise, something else wakes up. Sensation. Subtle, steady, the sound of your breath, the feel of your skin, the beat of your heart. These aren't distractions, they're anchors. They bring the mind out of thought and into being. And in being, healing happens, because so much of suffering is created by noise trying to protect you from feeling. But the feeling isn't the enemy, it's the key. When you let silence hold it, instead of thinking through it, the body knows how to process it. The silence does the work the thinking never could. This kind of quiet isn't passive, it's alive. It listens, it sees, it allows, and it begins to purify the mind, not by judging the noise, but by not feeding it. The more time you spend in that silence, the more the noise starts to feel optional. You no longer react to every opinion. You no longer follow every fear. You no longer chase every idea. You rest in the awareness that sees the mind moving, but doesn't move with it. There's a deeper intelligence that comes online here, the kind that doesn't come from analysis. It comes from space, from non-doing, from still presence that holds truth without forcing answers. This is why some of your clearest insights come not in the middle of thinking, but when you're walking, resting, breathing. That's when silence becomes not a break from life, but the way life speaks. You don't need to escape noise forever. Life will always have sound. But when the inner noise settles, outer noise doesn't shake you. You can walk through it without being pulled by it, because now silence walks with you, not as absence, but as strength. This also affects how you relate to others. When you no longer fear silence, you listen more deeply. You pause before speaking. You no longer feel the need to fill every gap, and people feel that. They feel your presence. They feel your calm. They feel safe with you, because you are safe with stillness. Stillness also resets your nervous system. Every moment spent in it is a message to the body. We are not in danger. That message, repeated enough, becomes a new baseline, one where reaction is replaced by reflection, where panic is replaced by patience, where the nervous system finally feels like it can stop bracing. This doesn't mean the mind never speaks again. It means it doesn't need to scream. It doesn't need to rush. It doesn't need to fill every space with commentary. It can rest. And when it does speak, it's clearer, cleaner, more useful, because it's no longer reacting to fear. It's responding from truth. Let the silence teach you, not through lessons, but through presence. Let it hold you until the mind forgets how to panic without a reason. Let it guide you into the part of yourself that never needed noise to exist, the part that was whole before thought ever arrived. You will still think, but you will no longer be trapped inside the thinking. You will still feel, but you will no longer drown in feeling. You will still act, but you will no longer be pushed by urgency. That is what silence restores. Let it stay with you. Let it follow you into the next moment. When silence finally feels safe, when the mind stops trying to fill every space with noise, something unexpected happens. Growth begins to unfold, not because it was forced, not because it was pushed, but because nothing stood in its way. The absence of mental interference becomes fertile soil. The letting go of control becomes the water. The stillness becomes the light. And what grows in that kind of space is not perfection. It's peace. That's where we go now, into the garden that grew without effort. Most people think peace must be earned. That calm is the reward for hard work, for fixing everything, for getting life perfectly in order. But that belief itself becomes a source of struggle. It makes rest feel undeserved. It makes stillness feel unproductive. It turns healing into a job and spirituality into a checklist. But Buddhism offers a different way, not to abandon effort, but to stop worshipping it, to stop believing that everything good must come through struggle. Because sometimes the most profound change comes when you stop trying to make it happen. Letting go of control is not weakness, it's clarity. It's recognizing the limits of your influence and choosing to trust what unfolds without your constant interference. In Buddhist thought, this is deeply tied to the law of karma, not in the sense of punishment or reward, but in understanding that actions carry energy. That effort has impact, but the results are not always yours to shape. You plant the seed, you water the soil, but the fruit appears in its own time. You can't pull it from the earth before it's ready, and trying to only brings frustration. Control is often a symptom of fear, a way to manage uncertainty, a way to avoid disappointment. The mind believes that if it just tries hard enough, plans deeply enough, anticipates every possibility, nothing will go wrong. But the truth is, things still go wrong. Not because of failure, because of life. Because the world moves in ways that are bigger than one person's effort. And when you stop fighting that truth, when you stop gripping every outcome, you make space for something much softer to arrive. That softness is trust. Trust that the work you've done is enough. Trust that growth doesn't need constant supervision. Trust that rest is not laziness. Trust that karma moves quietly and often slowly, but it moves. When you trust that, your energy stops going toward control and starts going toward presence. Presence doesn't mean doing nothing. It means doing what's needed without anxiety, acting with care, then releasing the outcome. This applies to everything: relationships, work, healing, even your spiritual path. You can show up fully without managing every detail. And when you do, your nervous system starts to relax, because it no longer feels like your survival depends on micromanaging life. This shift rewires your belief system. You begin to see that peace doesn't require perfection, that you don't have to get it all right to feel safe, that mistakes are not signs of failure, they're signs of movement. They're what happens when you're alive and trying, even imperfectly, plants seeds. Those seeds take root when the mind stops digging them up every 5 minutes to check if they're growing. The garden of inner peace is not built on control. It's built on consistency. Small acts of attention, kindness to yourself, breathing when you feel the urge to fix everything, noticing the impulse to panic and choosing stillness instead. Each time you let go, you strengthen a part of yourself that believes life doesn't need to be perfect to be beautiful. This also changes how you see others. When you no longer demand perfection from yourself, you stop demanding it from them. You stop needing people to act exactly how you expect in order to feel okay. You start letting them be human, and that freedom makes love possible. Real love, not the kind that clings, but the kind that flows. Control often blocks connection, because when you're busy managing every detail, you're not really present. You're planning, you're bracing, you're editing. But when you release that control, you start to listen differently. You start to feel people instead of fixing them. You start to relate without defense. And that's what builds peace in relationships. Even your relationship with yourself becomes softer. You stop measuring your value by how productive or perfect you've been. You stop turning every flaw into a crisis. You learn to sit with yourself as you are, not because you've solved everything, but because you've stopped demanding to be solved. That self-acceptance doesn't lead to stagnation. It leads to spaciousness. And in spaciousness, real growth finally has room to happen. The garden grows without you controlling every inch of it. And in doing so, it teaches you something important. Nature doesn't hurry, but it gets everything done. That's not a metaphor, it's a lesson. One the body begins to understand once the mind stops pushing. Karma doesn't reward struggle, it responds to intention. When your intentions are clean, when your actions come from clarity, peace grows, even if you can't see it right away. Even if things look messy on the surface, the seeds are still there. They're doing what they do, quietly, faithfully, without applause. You're allowed to trust that process, to stop proving, to stop perfecting, to stop turning every spiritual practice into a project. Sometimes the most sacred thing you can do is nothing, not out of neglect, but out of faith, that your presence alone is enough, that your silence is potent, that your being, not your doing, is where your strength comes from. Letting go doesn't mean giving up. It means giving over, giving the outcome to life, giving your heart some room to breathe, giving your mind a break from problem-solving what was never a problem to begin with. Most of what we try to control was never meant to be controlled. People's opinions, the timing of opportunities, the pace of healing, the past, the future. All of it softens when you stop holding so tightly. And what's left when you release that grip is presence. Gentle, grounded presence. A mind that watches rather than judges. A heart that opens rather than braces. A spirit that trusts rather than tenses. That's what a peaceful mind feels like. Not empty, not detached, just quiet and kind, like a garden that grows because the conditions are right, not because it was forced. Let this be your new rhythm. Show up, care deeply, and then let go, not out of apathy, but out of wisdom, because peace grows not in the noise of perfection, but in the silence of trust. When the garden is allowed to grow without force, something surprising starts to emerge alongside the peace. Energy. Not just calm energy, but powerful, raw energy. It doesn't come from control. It doesn't come from rushing. It rises naturally once resistance fades. But this energy can feel dangerous at first, especially when it comes in the form of anger or fierce ambition. That's where the next transformation begins. Because it's not the flame itself that causes harm, it's how we meet it. This is the flame that didn't burn the mind. Anger and ambition aren't problems. They are intense forms of life force. They come with heat, with momentum, with urgency. But when that intensity is met without mindfulness, it turns into destruction. Anger becomes reaction. Ambition becomes obsession. Both leave chaos behind, not because they're wrong, but because they weren't given direction. The key is not to extinguish these flames, it's to contain them, to use their heat to illuminate, not to burn. Buddhist teachings don't reject strong emotions. They invite awareness into them. They teach that what's dangerous is not the fire, but the absence of space around it. Anger without awareness consumes. Ambition without balance exhausts. But with awareness, they become tools. Anger can set boundaries. Ambition can move purpose forward. The difference is attention. The difference is presence. To work with fire, you first need to be honest about it. Many people suppress anger because they were taught it's wrong. Others suppress ambition because they were told it's selfish. But suppression only strengthens the emotion. It buries it until it explodes or leaks out sideways. Mindfulness starts by acknowledging what's present without judgment. There is heat in me right now. There is fire rising. You don't need to justify it. You don't need to push it down. You just need to name it. The next step is to locate it. Where does it live in the body? Is it in the chest, the jaw, the fists? What does it feel like? Tightness, pressure, buzzing? This step grounds the emotion. It brings it out of the mind and into the body where it can be felt instead of fed. That feeling process is what prevents escalation. It says to the nervous system, this is allowed. You don't have to react to get rid of it. Most people react to intense emotions because they're afraid of what will happen if they don't. But fear is what turns heat into harm. Without fear, the flame can simply be held, observed, directed. That's where mindfulness enters. You're not letting the flame take over, you're letting it inform. You're asking, what is this emotion pointing to that I've been avoiding? Anger, for example, often hides grief, or fear, or betrayal. It's a messenger, not a monster. When you meet it with curiosity instead of judgment, it reveals its root. And once you know what the root is, the emotion starts to change. The heat becomes clarity. The fire becomes focus. Ambition works the same way. On the surface, it looks like drive. But underneath, it might be the desire to prove something, to feel enough, to escape shame. If you meet it with mindfulness, you start to see whether your goals are coming from alignment or avoidance. And if they're from avoidance, you don't need to abandon them. You need to purify them. Strip away the fear, and what remains is pure intention. That's what moves mountains without burning out. Letting fire exist without chaos means building a container for it. That container is made of awareness, breath, and space. You give the emotion room to move without letting it control your actions. This is not passivity, it's strength. It's harder to hold anger with presence than to explode. It's harder to direct ambition with patience than to chase without rest. But the power that comes from that kind of control is different. It's not about domination. It's about inner mastery. Over time, the nervous system begins to trust fire. It stops bracing against anger. It stops fearing intensity. It begins to see that these emotions are not enemies. They're energies that can be moved through, shaped, and released. When the body learns this, the mind follows. Thought becomes less defensive. Reaction becomes less automatic. There is more space between stimulus and response. You stop saying things you regret in the heat of the moment. You stop over-committing because you're driven by urgency. You stop pushing yourself into exhaustion just to prove worth. Because now you know that the flame doesn't need to be extinguished. It needs to be heard, understood, and guided. This practice affects every part of life. Relationships deepen because anger no longer leads to rupture. Goals feel more alive because ambition no longer requires self-punishment. Creativity expands because fire becomes a fuel for inspiration instead of destruction. Even healing becomes faster, not because it's rushed, but because it's no longer blocked by suppressed energy. Letting fire exist without burning requires trust. Trust that your system can handle strong emotion. Trust that you don't have to fix everything immediately. Trust that the energy won't destroy you if you meet it with care. That trust builds slowly through practice, through each moment you choose breath instead of reaction, awareness instead of collapse, listening instead of judgment. In Buddhist practice, this is called holding the middle way. Not falling into denial, not falling into indulgence. Walking the center path with awareness. Letting fire walk beside you without burning your steps. That's what makes the flame sacred. That's what turns pain into wisdom. That's what transforms drive into direction. You don't need to be afraid of your intensity. You don't need to dilute your passion. You don't need to shut down your anger. You just need to meet it before it becomes destructive. You need to hold it like a torch, not too tightly, not too far away. Close enough to light your path, far enough not to consume your mind. This is the kind of power that feels clean. It doesn't drain. It doesn't wound. It energizes without overwhelming. Because it's no longer tied to fear. It's no longer trying to control everything. It's just moving, like breath, like blood, like fire through dry wood. Warm, bright, useful. Let it move through you. Let it shape you without breaking you. When fire is no longer feared, when intensity can be held without harm, the mind stops preparing for danger, and something lighter begins to rise. Not because everything is perfect, Not because the past has been erased, but because the nervous system no longer thinks joy needs to be postponed, no longer believes peace is something to earn. This is where the next release begins. The release of the belief that happiness is a reward, that presence must be purchased, that only after suffering has been endured is a smile allowed to rise. Now we begin the unlearning. This is the smile that wasn't earned. From early childhood, most people are taught to tie joy to accomplishment. If you behave, you get praise. If you win, you get a treat. If you succeed, you're worthy of celebration. That conditioning runs deep. It trains the mind to measure happiness as something external, something to chase, not something to feel for no reason. As a result, many people move through life unable to rest, unable to feel lightness, unable to soften, because they think they haven't done enough yet. This belief is rarely questioned, because it's everywhere, in culture, in work, in religion, in education. The idea that happiness must be justified has shaped entire generations. But Buddhist wisdom offers a different view. It teaches that joy is not something you earn, it's something you stop blocking. It's already here, underneath the striving. It doesn't require achievement, it requires presence. And presence cannot be bought, it can only be allowed. So the question becomes, what's in the way? What is stopping the smile that doesn't need a reason? Often, it's guilt. Guilt that things are not done yet. Guilt that others are suffering. Guilt that rest is selfish. And all of it comes from one core belief, that happiness must be deserved. But there is no law that says peace is only available after productivity. No rule that says you must prove your worth to feel okay in your own body. Letting joy arise freely begins with challenging that inner conditioning. You start by noticing when the thought appears. I can't relax yet. I haven't done enough. This isn't the right time to feel good. These are not facts. They are habits. Habits that can be softened through awareness and repetition. Joy doesn't need everything to be resolved. It only needs space. Space to breathe. Space to rise without being questioned. And that space can only be created when the mind stops acting like a gatekeeper. Every time you withhold happiness because something isn't finished, you train the nervous system to associate peace with delay. But every time you allow joy to appear in the middle of uncertainty, you teach yourself a new truth, that well-being is not on the other side of doing. This doesn't mean pretending to be happy. It means noticing the small flickers of ease that already exist and letting them stay. The warmth of sunlight, the taste of something simple, the feeling of being fully inside your breath. These moments are not rewards. They're reminders that joy doesn't need to be earned. It needs to be noticed. Buddhist practice encourages this noticing through mindfulness, through returning again and again to what's already here. The sensation of sitting, the sound of breath, the pause between movements. These are not distractions from work. They are life itself. And when you allow life to be enough, even for a moment, you create conditions for joy to appear without force. The smile that wasn't earned doesn't mean you've stopped caring. It means you've stopped withholding permission. You've stopped believing that struggle is the price of serenity. And in doing so, you create a new relationship with yourself. One where kindness isn't conditional. One where rest isn't shameful. One where lightness isn't suspicious. This shift transforms how you relate to effort. You can still work, still grow, still care deeply, but now your well-being doesn't hang in the balance. Now your nervous system knows that it doesn't have to pay in stress before it can feel calm, that peace is not the end of the journey, it's part of the path. You begin to laugh more, not because everything is fixed, but because nothing needs to be fixed for you to feel human. You cry more openly, because emotions no longer signal failure, they just mean you're alive. You speak with more warmth, because you're no longer holding your breath, waiting for permission to feel safe. This practice also changes how you see others. When you stop tying happiness to performance in yourself, you stop doing it to those around you. You stop judging people for resting. You stop projecting your guilt onto their ease. You start celebrating the simple joy in others without resentment. Because now you know that joy isn't unfair. It's natural. Letting joy rise without needing to earn it is also an act of rebellion against everything that taught you otherwise. It's saying no to generational shame, no to cultural pressure, no to the fear that says, if you feel good now, something bad must follow. That's not truth, that's trauma, and it can end with you. You do this by practicing the smile, not the fake one, the soft one, the one that rises when you stop bracing, the one that doesn't need an audience, the one that lives in the quiet after a deep exhale. That smile doesn't care about your resume. It doesn't care about your past. It doesn't ask what you fixed. It just appears when the mind lets it. And the more often you let it, the more natural it becomes. You're no longer chasing moments of happiness. You're creating conditions for happiness to find you. You're reprogramming your nervous system to believe that peace is safe. That joy doesn't need a receipt. That presence doesn't require a reason. Let this be your new baseline, not forced positivity, not avoidance, just an openness to joy when it knocks, even when the dishes aren't done, even when the world feels messy, even when you haven't solved everything, because the truth is, you never had to. You were always allowed to feel light, to breathe fully, to laugh before the end of the story, to rest in the middle of the journey, to feel okay without a list of accomplishments attached to your worth. That's what changes everything. Because when joy doesn't need to be earned, the mind stops running. And when the mind stops running, it's free to meet what comes next. A lesson in surrender that isn't weak. A door that doesn't need to be forced open. A closing that happens on its own, because it's time. When joy is no longer withheld, when the heart learns to open without a reason, the mind begins to lose its grip on control. Something loosens. Something deep inside stops grasping. You don't need to make it happen, it just begins. Like a breath that no longer strains to prove itself. Like a door that closes, not because it was slammed shut, but because it reached its final moment. That's where the next shift begins, not in effort, but in release. This is the door that closed by itself. Letting go is often misunderstood. It's seen as failure, as giving up, as passivity. But true surrender is not weakness, it's wisdom. It's the recognition that not everything is meant to be held. That some situations, some people, some outcomes are better left behind, not because they were worthless, but because they've served their purpose. The struggle ends not when everything is solved, but when you stop trying to carry what was never yours to carry. The need to hold on is usually fueled by fear. Fear of change, fear of loss, fear of not knowing what comes next. The mind tries to manage uncertainty by clinging to plans, to identities, to expectations. It says, if I just grip tighter, maybe I won't fall. But that grip becomes the cause of the very pain it's trying to avoid. It exhausts the body. It tightens the breath. It keeps the nervous system locked in survival mode. Surrender begins when you start noticing that grip. When you feel the tightness in your chest, the tension in your shoulders, the constant spinning of what-if thoughts. That's the signal. Not to fix, but to soften. Not to plan harder, but to step back. The first step of letting go is not action. It's awareness. In Buddhist thought, non-attachment is not indifference. It's intimacy without ownership. It's caring deeply, but not needing to control the outcome. You show up fully, you love fully, you try fully, and then you let life move. When the door closes by itself, it's not because you were passive, it's because you stopped pushing a wall and finally realized it was never a door at all. The difference between force and surrender is trust. Trust that life unfolds in ways the mind cannot predict. Trust that peace is not found in forcing a solution, but in allowing space for one to arise. Trust that endings are not failures, but transitions. A chapter closing is not the same as a story ending. Some doors close because you've grown. Others close because they were leading nowhere. Either way, their closing is part of your path. Letting go doesn't require a ceremony. It requires presence. It happens in the small moments. The moment you stop checking for a reply, the moment you stop rehearsing the conversation you'll never have, the moment you stop needing to be understood. These moments may feel subtle, but they're seismic, because every time you let go, you reclaim energy. Energy that was bound in grasping. Energy that can now return to you. There's a reason people say, I feel lighter after letting go. Because clinging is weight. It drags the heart down. It fogs the mind. It drains the spirit. And once it's released, the system can breathe again. The silence that follows may feel strange, but it's healing. It's space being restored. Letting go is also an act of compassion for yourself, because holding on often means self-blame. It means trying to make sense of something by endlessly looping through what you could have done differently. But not everything unresolved needs to be resolved by you. Some things heal not through effort, but through distance, through not feeding them any longer. You begin to notice that life supports letting go. The breath lets go at the end of every exhale. The body sheds skin cells every day. The trees drop their leaves without mourning. Nature shows you that release is not destruction, it's renewal. And you are not separate from nature. You too are designed to shed what no longer fits. This doesn't mean you stop caring. It means your care is no longer clinging. It means you can walk away without resentment. You can end something without needing to demonize it. You can feel sadness without turning it into a story of failure. You can say, this was, and still welcome what comes next. Sometimes the hardest thing to let go of is the version of yourself you thought you had to be. The image you worked so hard to uphold, the goals that no longer fit, the beliefs that no longer serve. But the self is not a fixed thing. It evolves. And part of evolving is releasing what once felt essential. That release is not an identity crisis. It's a return to your truth. You learn to trust the timing of closures, to not rush the process. Some doors take time. They creak slowly shut. They resist. That's okay. Surrender isn't instant. It's a practice, one that deepens each time you notice the tension, breathe into it and say, I don't need to hold this. Meditation helps with this, because it trains you to watch thoughts without clinging, to feel feelings without becoming them, to sit in discomfort without reacting. Every time you practice letting a thought pass without chasing it, you strengthen your capacity to let go in life. You become less controlled by habits of attachment. You start to trust that peace isn't found in holding everything together, but in letting what's ready to fall, fall. Letting go also changes how you move forward. You stop dragging the past into every future step. You stop trying to reopen closed doors. You begin to walk through the world with open hands, and that openness becomes magnetizing. Life flows more freely toward those who are not grasping for it. Opportunities, insights, connections, they arise more easily when you're not gripping control. This doesn't mean you stop showing up. It means you show up differently. You act from alignment, not desperation. You move with clarity, not panic. You speak your truth without needing to convince. You give your energy without needing guarantees. That's the kind of action that carries power, because it's rooted in surrender, not in fear. The door that closes by itself teaches a final truth. Not everything requires your intervention. Some things resolve when you get out of the way. Some situations mend when you stop fixing. Some peace arrives when you stop chasing. Your job is not to force. It's to feel, to notice, to respond with wisdom instead of reaction. When the door closes by itself and the mind no longer needs to force endings or chase beginnings, something even quieter begins to fade. Not a person, not a memory, but a concept. The idea of who you were supposed to be, the one who tried so hard, the one who carried expectations, the one who lived through labels and roles. It starts to dissolve, not in pain, but in relief. And in that soft dissolving, the most peaceful truth begins to emerge. You were never only that name, never only that story. This is the path walked by the monk who forgot his name. Identity addiction doesn't start as arrogance. It starts as survival, a way to belong, a way to be seen, a way to organize the chaos of early life into something stable. The mind grabs hold of traits, titles, roles. It says, "This is who I am." And then it begins defending it, building a world around it, maintaining it at all costs. Over time, the label becomes the lens. Every thought filtered, every action weighed, every reaction predicted. But Buddhist teachings reveal something deeper, that the self you think you are, the personality, the reputation, the achievements, is not fixed. It's a bundle of changing processes, thoughts that come and go, emotions that rise and pass, perceptions that shift with each new experience. The suffering begins when you take those processes and say, "This is me." Because now, anything that threatens that identity feels like a threat to your existence. When the monk forgot his name, It wasn't because he lost his memory. It was because he no longer needed it to be at peace. He no longer needed a label to feel real, no longer needed a role to feel worthy. And that forgetting wasn't a loss, it was freedom. Most people fear losing identity because they confuse it with meaning. But identity is not meaning. It's a container, a temporary form, a useful tool, but not the truth. You can use it, but when you become it, you shrink. You become trapped in a version of yourself that was built to be accepted, but not to be whole. Ego detachment doesn't mean becoming nobody. It means realizing that nobody has to be fixed. It's the ability to shift roles without losing self-respect, to hear criticism without collapse, to fail without internal collapse, to succeed without superiority. It's a mental baseline that doesn't move every time the world offers a new mirror. This detachment brings softness, because when you're not defending a fragile identity, you stop needing to argue, to prove, to win every conversation. You can just listen. You can just be. And people around you feel that ease. They relax too, because your presence is not trying to dominate. It's simply there. Letting go of identity doesn't mean you abandon your values or personality. It means you stop gripping them like armor. You let them evolve. You allow the version of you that made sense 10 years ago to fade. You stop mourning the image that others wanted you to be. You begin to inhabit who you are without apology and without attachment to whether it's impressive, liked, or understood. This changes everything. Because when identity is no longer your foundation, peace becomes your resting state. You stop performing for validation. You stop comparing for reassurance. You stop editing your authenticity to fit the room. There is less noise, less pretending, less pressure to constantly define yourself. Meditation helps to see this. When you sit long enough, the identity begins to dissolve naturally. You watch thoughts arrive, label themselves, and pass. You notice emotions that feel like identity, shyness, anger, pride, appear and disappear. You start to ask, if I can observe it, how can it be me? That question is the beginning of freedom. This doesn't happen all at once. Identity unravels in layers. The role at work, the version of you that people expect, the self that was shaped by family. Each layer softened, not rejected, released, not erased. And what remains is awareness, clean, open, spacious, not needing a story to feel real. This awareness can hold anything: joy, sorrow, confusion, laughter. But it doesn't become any of them. That's what makes it peaceful. Not because it never feels, but because it never clings. The monk who forgot his name didn't become empty. He became whole. Because in forgetting the constructed self, he returned to the felt self. The part that breathes without asking permission. The part that loves without rehearsing. The part that exists before the world says what it should look like. This return is not dramatic. It's not loud. It's a quiet falling away, a soft exhale, a loosening of the grip on who you thought you had to be. And in that looseness, life enters more fully. Because now you're not managing it, you're meeting it. Letting go of identity also reduces suffering in daily life. because most pain isn't caused by the event, it's caused by what that event says about your identity. If I fail, it means I'm a failure. If they leave, it means I'm unlovable. If I'm wrong, it means I'm nothing. But when those labels fall away, the event becomes just a moment, not a definition, not a verdict. This opens a new way of living, one where curiosity replaces judgment, where presence replaces protection, where truth doesn't need to be defended, only spoken. You can admit when you're wrong without shame. You can change your mind without fear. You can ask for help without losing worth, because there's no image to protect anymore. Relationships change too, because when you're not trying to be somebody, you can truly see others, not as roles, not as extensions of your identity, but as their own mysterious unfolding. Conversations deepen, conflict softens, the need to be right dissolves into the joy of being real, and from that space you can still serve, still lead, still grow. But now, the effort is clean. It's not about building a name, it's about expressing what's true. The monk may have forgotten his name, but he didn't forget his purpose. He just no longer needed his purpose to be admired. Let this forgetting be an invitation to stop defining and start experiencing, to stop labeling and start living, to see that the most peaceful mind is not the one that has figured out who it is, but the one that no longer needs to. When the identity dissolves, when the name no longer defines the self, something deeper and quieter becomes noticeable. The chase loses its urgency. The inner arguments fade. The search slows. What's left is not emptiness. It's space. The mind stops needing to become someone, to go somewhere, to reach some final version of peace. Because the peace was never at the end. It was always under the running. And that's where this final lesson begins. The path that ended in stillness. So much of life is built around motion, around goals, improvement, becoming better, getting further. The idea is that if you keep walking, something greater will come. That peace is a prize, waiting at the top of some internal mountain. But Buddhism reveals a different kind of path. One that doesn't climb, it dissolves. One that doesn't add, it subtracts. Until all that remains is what was always here. Stillness. Not the stillness of boredom, but the stillness of presence, of complete arrival, of nothing left to chase. The mind is trained to run, to wake up and begin the checklist, to see time as a measurement of success, to judge rest as laziness, to think, if I stop now, I'll fall behind. But what if there is no race? What if there's nothing you're late for? What if the only thing keeping you from peace is the belief that peace requires effort? Striving can serve its purpose. It sharpens skill, it moves energy, it builds experience. But when striving becomes identity, when it becomes the default mode of being, it replaces awareness with urgency. It says, I'll be okay when this is finished. I'll be whole when that is complete. But every time you arrive at one goal, the mind creates another, and the treadmill continues. Not because you haven't achieved enough, but because the striving itself became home. This is the moment the path asks you to stop, not to give up, not to turn back, but to stop running, to see where you already are, to notice that the stillness you've been seeking isn't a reward at the finish line, it's the ground beneath your feet. Stillness is not lack of movement, it's freedom from being pulled. It's the space where you can move, but don't need to, where you can act, but don't chase. It's a state of inner stability, where the external world can swirl, but you are not lost in it. And it becomes possible when the mind stops using the future as an escape from now. The path to stillness is not created, it's revealed. It's what's left when you stop adding, when you stop proving, when you stop fixing what was never broken. And that doesn't mean life stops. It means the part of you that always felt behind no longer drives your choices. There's a calm that rises when you stop asking, "What's next?" and start asking, "What's here?" That question breaks the cycle of endless forward motion. It roots you in direct experience. The breath, the weight of your body, the presence of being alive. These are not side notes. They are the truth underneath every goal you ever set. Meditation doesn't take you somewhere else. It brings you to the center of where you already are. And that's why it feels unfamiliar. Because most of your life has been spent slightly ahead of yourself, leaning forward into tasks, into plans, into ideas of who you should be. Meditation reverses that lean. It teaches the body how to rest in the present without apology. Stillness doesn't mean nothing changes. It means you're no longer trying to outrun change. You meet it, you move with it, you allow it, without needing to control its pace. And this shift, this deep unwinding, reprograms the nervous system. The mind no longer sees stillness as stagnation. It begins to trust that things grow even when you're not pushing. Even purpose becomes quieter in stillness. Not gone, just simplified. You stop needing your life to be extraordinary to feel meaningful. You stop waiting for some grand moment to feel satisfied. You begin to feel meaning in the small, in the soft, in the pauses between effort. And that's where real joy begins to live. Stillness also reveals clarity. Because when you stop running, the dust settles, and what once felt confusing begins to sort itself, not through force, but through space. The answers that never came while thinking arrive in silence. The solutions you couldn't find in urgency rise in quiet moments of presence. Not because they weren't available, but because you finally stopped long enough to listen. And in that listening, you meet a version of yourself you might have never met before. One that doesn't perform, one that doesn't measure, one that doesn't need a title to be worthy. This self is not made, it's remembered. It's the one that was here before the striving began. Letting the path end in stillness doesn't mean the end of growth. It means the end of using growth as a way to earn your place in the world. It means knowing that the breath you're taking now is not preparing for life. It is life. That your value isn't hidden in the future. It's visible right now, if you're still enough to see it. Relationships shift in stillness too. You stop expecting others to fill the restlessness. You stop needing them to mirror your worth. You begin to connect without agenda, to love without possession, to listen without interruption, because the part of you that once needed to chase is now resting, and rest creates space for real connection. Letting the mind stop running also makes room for compassion. You become less reactive, less defensive, less afraid. Because you're no longer operating from scarcity, you no longer believe that peace is scarce, that time is slipping, that you're falling behind. Stillness shows you there is enough. You are enough. And from that place, kindness flows more naturally, not as a performance, but as a reflection of your settled state. This is not a one-time realization. It's a practice, a returning. Each time the mind starts to sprint, you notice, you soften, you pause. Not forever, just long enough to feel the ground again, long enough to remember that no version of the future will ever give you more presence than the one available now. You start to walk differently, speak differently, breathe differently. You stop trying to force insight. You let it arrive. You stop trying to impress the world. You start trying to meet it, fully, softly, from the center of who you are, not the idea of who you need to become. Stillness is not the end of your path. It is the essence of it. It is what all the running was secretly searching for. Not recognition, not victory, but rest. A place where the self can simply be, without tension, without story, without delay. Let the path dissolve under your feet. Let the rush fade. Let the thoughts come without pulling you. Let the breath settle without direction. Let now be enough. When the path ends in stillness and the body learns to stop chasing, what begins to unravel next is even more subtle. The noise doesn't come from the world anymore. It comes from within. Not loud, but persistent. A quiet hum that asks to be heard. A comment forming before someone finishes speaking. A reaction waiting in the wings. A thought hoping someone notices it. It's not about truth. It's about attention. And this is where a new layer of freedom waits. The freedom of letting go of the need to be heard. This is the thought that didn't want attention. The mind doesn't just think, it craves response. Most thoughts aren't content with simply passing through. They want to be validated, agreed with, answered. They want a reaction, whether it's from someone else or from your own mind. This is not thinking for clarity. It's thinking for significance. It's the ego's need to be noticed, and it happens almost constantly. Every mental comment, every judgment, every plan or opinion doesn't just arise and dissolve. It sticks because it's trying to be important. It's not enough to have the thought. There must be an inner or outer nod, a feeling that says, yes, you're right, that matters, keep going. And the more this craving is fed, the more deeply it gets wired, not just as a habit of thought, but as a habit of identity. Buddhist wisdom points to this pattern without condemnation. It names it as part of the human condition, a natural byproduct of a mind that was built to protect and define. But just because it's common doesn't mean it has to control you. That's the purpose of practice, to begin noticing where the mind adds importance to thoughts that were never asking to stay. Some thoughts are just wind. They arise and fall. But when the ego is active, it chases every gust, thinking it might lead somewhere. That chase becomes internal noise, a mental dialogue that never pauses, because the thinker is more interested in being noticed than being free. Freedom begins when attention no longer becomes currency, when the thought doesn't need approval, when the comment doesn't need to land, when you can witness your own mind without echoing it back to yourself or the world. That witnessing is not silence, it's peace. This shift is not dramatic. It happens in ordinary moments. You're in conversation, and a clever thought forms, but you don't say it. You're scrolling, and you think of something to post, but you don't share it. You hear a wrong statement, and the urge to correct rises, but you let it pass. Not because you've given up, but because you no longer need to insert yourself to feel real. This is not suppression, it's clarity. You're not holding back, you're letting go. You're releasing the belief that every thought is a gift the world needs, that every reaction must be spoken, that your mind's narrative needs a stage. It doesn't. And when the need for attention fades, what's left is something far more valuable, inner quiet that doesn't depend on external echoes. This applies just as deeply to the internal relationship you have with your thoughts. Most people are constantly responding to their own mind, arguing with it, agreeing with it, explaining things to themselves, all day, every day. The thought forms, and the inner narrator rushes in to comment. Yes, that's true. No, that's stupid. Let's remember that. Let's worry about this. It's a full-time job, and it keeps the nervous system alert and the sense of self tightly woven into language. But there's another way. A thought can arise, and you can simply see it. Not follow it, not debate it, not capture it. Just see it. As you would see a leaf fall, with no impulse to write it down or do anything about it. That's not numbness, that's presence. That's when the ego no longer needs to be validated every 5 seconds to feel safe. The ego wants attention because it believes attention is survival. It was trained to think that being seen is proof of being. But being exists whether you are seen or not. Your presence is not defined by how often your thoughts are heard. And once that is understood, the compulsion begins to dissolve. This also changes how you express yourself. You start speaking with intention, not because there's silence to fill or insecurity to manage, but because there's something honest to say, something that adds rather than asserts. Words become lighter, conversations become more genuine. You listen more, you interrupt less. You realize that the need to always be right, clever, or noticed was just noise. In letting go of this mental performance, you become more real, more relaxed. People feel it. There's less pressure in your presence, less tension in your words, because you're not trying to win anything. You're not trying to be someone. You're just here. And that kind of presence is powerful. It also restores energy, because constantly needing attention, whether from others or from your own mind, is exhausting. It creates an endless inner dialogue that consumes your focus and burns your clarity. When the ego rests, space opens, not just in your mind, but in your nervous system. You breathe differently, you move differently, you respond instead of react. Meditation helps this unfold. It's a training ground for attention without attachment. Thoughts come, you notice, but you don't engage. The thought that says, "Say something smart," is seen and left untouched. The thought that says, "Prove yourself," is met with breath, not response. Over time, the mind learns. Not every thought is a command. Some are just echoes. Some are just patterns. And none of them require applause. The more you live this way, the less dramatic your relationship with your mind becomes. You don't need to silence it. You just stop needing to perform with it. The thoughts that once seemed urgent lose their volume. The impulses that once seemed necessary lose their grip. And in that loosening, peace rises. Not because the mind has disappeared, but because its need for validation has. You realize your worth doesn't grow when someone agrees with your opinion. It doesn't shrink when someone disagrees. It doesn't move with attention. It rests in awareness. And from that awareness, you move forward differently. Not louder, not smaller, just steady, because the thought no longer needs to be heard. It's enough to simply be. When the need to be heard disappears, when thoughts no longer demand applause, the mind begins to rest in a deeper kind of presence, one that isn't measured by impact, attention, or reaction. It simply watches. And in that watching, the self begins to shift. What once felt personal no longer pulls so hard. What once felt like identity becomes sensation. What once felt permanent begins to pass. That's where the next truth begins to reveal itself, not in what's felt, but in who is watching. This is the sky that didn't mind the weather. Suffering often begins when awareness becomes entangled with experience. A painful thought arises, and the mind says, "This is me." A difficult emotion moves through, and the heart believes, "This defines me." The weather changes, and the sky forgets that it is still sky. But Buddhism teaches that awareness is not the storm. It is the space the storm moves through, and that space is never harmed by what passes through it. Most people live as if every emotion is a verdict, as if sadness means failure, as if anger means regression, as if fear means weakness. But what if these emotions aren't labels? They're weather. Passing conditions that arise, express, and fade. What if none of them are personal, permanent, or proof of who you are? The sky doesn't resist the storm. It holds it, without judgment, without panic, without needing it to be different. And this is the core of peaceful awareness, the ability to remain open, even when discomfort is moving through. The willingness to witness without becoming. Not because you're avoiding the emotion, but because you're no longer identifying with it. This shift changes the entire internal landscape. Pain no longer becomes a threat. It becomes an event. Anger no longer becomes a character flaw. It becomes a signal. Grief no longer becomes identity. It becomes movement. You stop clinging to pleasure as if it will save you. You stop fearing discomfort as if it will destroy you. Everything becomes what it is, a temporary condition, not a permanent truth. To access this awareness, you don't need to fight your emotions. You need to see them with softness, with curiosity, with space. You name what arises, but you stop tying it to your self-worth. Sadness is here, not "I am sad." Frustration is rising, not "I am angry again, like always." That language is more than semantics. It is liberation. It separates the storm from the sky. This witnessing is not passive. It is engaged. It notices how anger tightens the shoulders, how grief pulls at the chest, how fear shortens the breath. But it doesn't react to those sensations with panic or escape. It rests inside them, allowing them to complete their cycle. And when the cycle is allowed, suffering transforms into experience, not into joy, not always into ease, but into something you don't have to fight. Buddhist insight sees this clearly through the lens of impermanence. Nothing stays, no emotion, no thought, no mood. What you are feeling now will not last. That truth, when fully felt, becomes the foundation of inner freedom. It reminds you that peace is not the absence of storms. It is the remembering of the sky. Even in deep suffering, this perspective holds power. The pain may be real, but it doesn't have to become identity. The grief may be overwhelming, but it doesn't define your nature. You can cry while remembering that the tears are temporary. You can tremble while knowing that trembling is movement, not essence. And that knowledge softens the experience. It gives you room to breathe inside what used to suffocate you. Meditation deepens this practice. Each time you sit, you watch thoughts come and go. Emotions arise and dissolve. Sensations shift and pass. This repetition trains the mind to stop gripping, to stop personalizing everything. It shows the mind what the body already knows. Nothing holds forever. The wave always returns to the ocean. When awareness takes the front seat, experience becomes lighter, not less meaningful, just less sticky. You begin to trust that even in difficulty, you are okay, not because everything is easy, but because you are no longer merged with every fluctuation. You've created a small gap, and inside that gap is peace. This doesn't mean you become detached or cold, quite the opposite. You feel everything fully, but you no longer confuse feeling with becoming. You no longer tie your identity to your emotional weather. You feel sadness without drowning. You feel joy without clinging. You feel fear without shrinking. Because your center is not moving with every gust of wind. This shift also affects your relationships. When you see others as weather moving through their own sky, you become less reactive. You stop taking things personally. You stop needing to fix every discomfort. You offer presence instead of correction, because you know that what's rising in them will pass too. That presence, not pressure, is what creates healing. Stillness becomes more accessible when you live this way, because stillness doesn't require silence. It requires non-resistance. The sky is still even when the wind moves fast. Stillness is not what's happening, it's how you're meeting what's happening. When you no longer resist your experience, you stop feeding it with fear. You begin to live more lightly, not because life got easier, but because you are no longer carrying every passing thought and feeling like a permanent backpack. You carry nothing. You walk open. You trust what comes, and you trust what leaves. You stop labeling every sensation as good or bad, and you start letting everything belong. That belonging is what heals fragmentation. You no longer run from discomfort. You sit with it. You no longer chase comfort. You allow it. You stop measuring every moment by how it feels and start appreciating every moment for what it is, another cloud passing through an infinite sky. You stop asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and start asking, "Can I meet this with presence?" This is what the sky teaches: to remain open, to remain steady, to not personalize the passing weather, because storms will come, and joy will come, and none of them will stay. The sky doesn't need to change to allow the weather. It simply makes space. Let yourself be that space. Not to escape emotion, but to stop being swallowed by it. Let awareness be large enough to hold the hardest truths without collapsing. Let presence be soft enough to feel everything and still remain whole. When the sky stops fearing the storm and the witness no longer resists what comes and goes, the mind begins to meet darkness differently, not as something to run from, not as something to defeat, but as something to light. That's when anxiety starts to lose its grip. Not because it disappears, but because it's met by something stronger than control, presence. This is where we begin to understand the candle that lit the darkness without fear. Anxiety often enters through uncertainty, the unknown future, the unresolved moment, the unanswered question. The mind reacts by planning, rehearsing, predicting. It tries to create safety by building a mental map of everything that could go wrong. But those maps don't protect you. They trap you. They make peace feel far away, locked behind the next plan, the next answer, the next perfect condition. Buddhism doesn't try to erase fear by answering every question. It offers a different kind of strength, the kind that doesn't need to know everything to stand still. Fear becomes panic when the mind believes it must fix the moment. That belief turns discomfort into danger. But presence softens that belief. It says, "This is what's here," not "this should not be." It meets the tension without needing to untie every knot. That meeting is what transforms fear into something else, not into joy, but into awareness, into steadiness, into enough. The candle is not afraid of the dark, not because the dark has changed, but because the candle remembers what it is. Light is not louder than darkness. It's just different. It reveals. It doesn't fight. This is how presence meets anxiety. It doesn't argue. It allows. It doesn't need to overpower. It simply stays. Anxiety feeds on rejection. Every time you say, "This shouldn't be happening," fear grows. Every time you brace, tension deepens. Every time you predict disaster, the body believes it's real. Presence does the opposite. It says, "This is what I feel, and I can still stay with it." That staying begins to change the relationship between you and your mind. Courage in Buddhism is not bravado. It's gentleness that doesn't run. It's awareness that doesn't flinch. It's the ability to feel fear without making it an emergency. To breathe with anxiety instead of against it. To say yes to discomfort not because you like it, but because it's already here. This kind of courage is learned slowly, through small choices. You notice the tightness in your chest, and you breathe into it instead of avoiding it. You feel the rapid thoughts, and you sit instead of distracting. You hear the alarm in your mind, and you respond with presence instead of panic. These moments are not small. They are how the nervous system rewires, one breath at a time. Every time you stay, your body learns that presence is safety, not knowing, not fixing, but being. The more often you stay, the less urgently the mind demands escape. The less fear you feed, the more space there is for clarity to return, not through force, but through allowance. Stillness in the face of anxiety is not passivity. It's strength that isn't loud. It's like a tree in the wind. It bends, it feels, but it doesn't break, because it's rooted. That route is your breath, your body, this moment. Nothing else is needed to begin. Often, anxiety isn't about now. It's about next. It's about the fear of what might happen, the loss that might come, the failure that might unfold. But when you return to now, most of that fear dissolves, because most of what you fear isn't happening. It's a shadow, a projection, a mental story that's been rehearsed so often it feels real. But presence doesn't argue with the story, it just stops feeding it. Buddhism invites this return over and over, not to escape the world, but to meet it fully, to come back to the body, to the breath, to the step under your foot. This practice doesn't promise you won't feel fear again. It promises you don't have to be owned by it. You don't have to narrate it. You don't have to build a life around it. The more often you turn toward the feeling instead of away, the more you learn that you are bigger than your fear, that the candle is still lit, that darkness doesn't define the room. It simply fills the space until light returns. And light returns more easily when you stop waiting for everything to be fixed before you breathe again. Let this be the practice. When fear rises, breathe slower. When the mind spins, come back to the weight of your body. When the heart races, speak gently to yourself, not with solutions, but with presence, with words that remind your system, we are not in danger right now, we can stay. This is not about defeating fear. It's about understanding that you can walk with it. That fear doesn't need to leave for peace to enter. They can exist together. The presence becomes the container, a wide enough space to hold both. Relationships benefit from this too. Because when you're no longer ruled by your anxiety, you stop projecting it onto others. You stop needing people to reassure you constantly. You stop reading danger into silence. You start listening more clearly, speaking more calmly, holding others with the same steadiness you're learning to hold yourself. Courage becomes your default, not because you're fearless, but because you're not running. You're no longer giving fear the microphone. It may still talk, but it doesn't drive. And in that shift, life opens. Not because it's safer, but because you've stopped shrinking from it. This kind of presence does more than soothe. It empowers, because when you're not tangled in what might happen, you can act, not react, not flinch, but respond from clarity. That response has weight. It carries truth. It moves energy without panic. Let yourself feel the fear. Let it rise. Let it move through. But don't believe it needs a solution. Sometimes the solution is simply being with it until it passes, and it always passes. Every wave has a crest. Every night has a morning. Even the longest storm makes space for stillness. The candle that lights the darkness doesn't wait for someone else to bring peace. It becomes peace. Not by being the strongest, but by being steady, by not needing to run, by trusting that the dark does not undo the light. Let that be your new strength. Not control, but calm. Not escape, but presence. And from that presence, we move again towards silence, not the absence of thought, but the presence of meaning. The kind that doesn't ask for noise, because it knows the truth is already enough. When fear no longer controls your steps and presence becomes your quiet strength, the need for external answers begins to fall away. You stop asking others to validate your peace. You stop chasing noise to find direction. Because something deeper starts to rise, not louder, but clearer. A kind of understanding that doesn't arrive through words. A kind of truth that doesn't speak, yet is always heard. This is where we turn now, toward the bell that rang without sound. The mind is trained to listen to volume. It looks for meaning in what is said, in what is repeated, in what demands attention. But the deepest insights in life do not arrive through shouting. They arrive in stillness. They appear in moments so quiet that most people miss them. A glance that feels like a memory, a breath that slows without reason, a pause that somehow answers the question. The bell rings, not through the ears, but through the awareness behind them. This is what Buddhism points to when it speaks of inner silence. Not a forced quiet, not a blank emptiness, but a space inside you that listens without needing language. This silence is not absence, it's presence without effort. It's knowing without explanation. When you touch it, even for a moment, it leaves behind a kind of peace that cannot be described, only returned to. The problem is not that silence is unavailable. The problem is that most people are never still enough to hear it. Their minds are filled with commentary, their bodies filled with urgency, their attention pulled by noise that promises answers but only delivers distraction. The bell rings, but they are too busy to notice. Silence doesn't beg to be heard. It waits, patiently, quietly, until you are ready to listen without demand, until the mind has burned off its questions and the heart no longer needs immediate resolution. That is when it comes. That is when truth reveals itself, not as a sentence, but as a felt sense. You don't hear the answer, you become it. You begin to notice how much of your thinking has been a substitute for clarity, trying to talk your way into peace, trying to reason your way through emotion. But silence shows you what words never could. It doesn't explain, it points, it doesn't fill the gap. It reveals that the gap was never a problem. This shift changes everything. You no longer feel the need to speak every thought. You no longer chase insights from others as if your own mind has nothing to offer. You start trusting what arises when the noise fades. That trust doesn't come from logic. It comes from experience, the experience of silence itself. Meditation becomes more than a tool. It becomes a return, a coming home to the place within you that never needed to be taught what matters. That already knows, that already sees, that doesn't move with every thought because it was never built on thought to begin with. This is the space where the bell rings. And once you feel it, you begin to hear it in places you didn't expect. In a long pause during a conversation, in the silence after a difficult moment, in the quiet between one breath and the next. These are not empty moments. They are full, overflowing with meaning that can't be captured with words. You start to understand why some of the greatest truths have never been spoken, why some wisdom lives in poetry, in art, in stillness, not in instruction. Because the mind can be taught, but the soul must be shown. And silence is its first language. This realization also shifts your priorities. You stop craving more information and start craving more depth. You read fewer things, but feel them more. You speak less, but mean more. You stop filling time and start feeling it. Because now you know that the real conversation is not always happening out loud. You also begin to respect the power of your own silence. You stop trying to interrupt every moment with an answer. You stop needing to fill every space with commentary. You let things land. You let them echo. You listen to others, not just with your ears, but with your entire presence. And that kind of listening changes relationships. People feel heard, not just by your responses, but by your attention. They feel safe in your silence, because you're no longer trying to fix everything. You're just being with it. And that being is more healing than any advice could ever be. This practice of silent listening also helps you hear yourself more clearly. Not the reactive voice, not the anxious chatter, but the quiet knowing underneath. The part of you that already understands what needs to happen, what matters, what can be let go. That part never raises its voice. It just waits for you to lower yours. Let yourself return to that part often, not through effort, through softening, through pausing, through choosing not to speak when you don't need to, through letting the breath be enough, through trusting that wisdom doesn't always come with a label. Let silence be your teacher. Let it ring its bell when everything else goes quiet. Let it carry you through moments where nothing makes sense, until suddenly something does. Not through analysis, but through presence. You don't need to know everything. You don't need to explain everything. You just need to stay close to what feels true. And truth doesn't scream. It stands. It stays. It waits until the mind is soft enough to receive it. And when that happens, you'll know. Not because someone told you, but because the silence spoke and you finally listened. And now it will carry you toward the next stillness. One that doesn't ask to be filled, but honored. If you've made it here, something in you was ready. Ready to stop chasing, ready to breathe deeper, ready to let go of the stories that kept you stuck. For over 3 hours, you've walked through silence, through stillness, through thoughts that no longer needed attention, and through fears that didn't need to be defeated, just witnessed. You've stepped into the sacred pause between desires. You've sat with the whisper that calmed the judge. You've watched the cloud forget to storm, the flame rise without burning, the monk forget his name, and the sky hold every emotion without becoming any of them. This was never about becoming someone new. It was about remembering who you were before the noise. Not fixing the mind, but freeing it. Reprogramming not with effort, but with presence. Letting the mind unlearn its habits of grasping, performing, proving, and returning instead to a state so simple we almost forgot it was allowed. Peace. And if this brought you peace, even just a flicker of it, leave a comment below. Tell us what shifted, what part spoke to you, what thought you're finally ready to let go of. Your story might become someone else's beginning. If you'd like more of this energy, more of this space to breathe and rewire, make sure to subscribe and turn on the bell. This isn't just content, it's practice. And you're invited to return anytime you need it. Until next time, let the silence keep teaching you, let the stillness keep holding you, and let the peace you've tasted tonight stay with you long after the video ends.